Hi, welcome back guys, this is your friend, WTFW with another fiction. What if Deku become a Pokemon trainer? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Today of all days, Izuku Midoriya was feeling a plethora of different emotions all at once. Excitement, joy, stress, fear, anxiety. Now you may be wondering why he is feeling this way. Well, today is the day that he and the rest of his class are able to use their quirks in an all-out mock villain versus mock hero exercise. So he was excited. He also got paired up with a very pretty girl called Ochako Uraraka. So he was happy. It was also the first time he would be using his quirk, which he knew from the get-go was extremely unstable and possibly damaging or fatal to his body. So he was stressed. He and Uraraka paired up against two people with extremely powerful and versatile quirks that each had much skill in using, so he was anxious. However, one of those opponents just so happened to be his ex-childhood friend and bully, Bakugo Katsuki. And judging by the look on his face, he was out for blood, so yeah, he was shitting his pants. Izuku tried to cool his nerves as he and Uraraka crept around the building where the fake weapon was being guarded. He even attempted to make a plan with Uraraka to secure victory. Ultimately, it came down to Izuku distracting Bakugo, knowing he would come after him, while Uraraka snuck around and tried to secure the weapon from Ida. And things happened just as planned. Bakugo charged in head first through the whole building, while hunting for Izuku like a savage. Izuku faced Katsuki head-on, while Uraraka made her way up the building. The two teens were in a standoff with Izuku visibly injured from several of Katsuki's explosions. They were about to attack one another when something strange stopped them in their tracks. An unusual portal appeared out from the ceiling, and its presence alone was enough to stop the superpowered teens from their scuffle. The portal generated a strange aura while emitting an otherworldly sound. It was a luminescent gray with a white spider web-like design that appeared to never-ending suck itself in. After staring at the strange portal for a solid minute, it began to fluctuate, and screams could be heard coming from within it. Several seconds passed as the screaming only got louder, and a shape could be seen forming closer to the opening of the portal. Another moment passed, and a screaming object hurled through the portal and crashed among the rubble around the building. Stones flung all over the place, and a huge dust cloud exploded far enough to make the two teens cover their eyes. Meanwhile, the portal behind them immediately closed after spitting out its passenger. After a few moments, the dust to see what had burst through into their mock exams. A small groan is heard from the dust and rubble. "Ooh, my head," came a voice clearly in pain. Another second later, and a silhouette broke the dust cloud and unearthed stones around itself. After a few minutes of watching the silhouette stubble and pick itself up from the ground, it finally came into the open to reveal a person, a regular human person. "What hit me?" the person asked while holding their head. The person rubbed their head and back while saying, "That's the last time I let Hao convince me to have a Malisad eating contest with Nebi." Once the person walked closer to the stunned teens, they could now make their description. It was a tall, slender, yet medium-built guy with tan skin. He looked a bit older than Izuku and Katsuki, with medium-length yet thick purple hair on top, black hair coming at his back and sides, yellow eyes, and a weird fashion sense. He wore a white and purple headband with black trim, and an odd symbol that looked like two half-circle lines covering a circle. The headband also separated his purple and black hair, making it look like a weird hat. He wore a white muscle shirt and an opened purple hoodie with odd red eye marks on the hood. Black and purple shorts with white and purple shoes. Around his waist was a belt made of a conglomerate of different sized bags, some of which had evil little faces with the mouth being the zipper. After shaking himself off from the dust and getting back his calibrations, the older teen finally noticed the other younger teens standing in front of him in stunned silence. He looked around at his surroundings and back at the teens a few times to ensure he didn't imagine this. After a minute, he side-mouthed to the air and said, I don't think we're in Alola anymore, Nebi. After a moment of no response, the teen looked to his side and said, Nebi. That's when a look of panic exploded across his face, and he began to shout into the open. Nebi? Nebi? Where are you? As the teen shouted around for this Nebi person, the other two teens finally came out of their shock and started to put together what happened. So did their personalities. Bakugo was the first to snap out of his trance and shouted, Hey, purple fucker. The teen turned to Bakugo, looked around, and pointed to himself with a confused face. Yes, you, I'm talking to you. Who the hell else is wearing purple? Don't look down on me. Izuku did want to point out that the size difference between the two was exceedingly significant. In fact, the older teen towered over Bakugo by at least 5 inches, but decided to keep quiet, knowing full well what he'd do. The guy put his hands up defensively and exclaimed, Whoa, 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 whoa. Let's just calm down for a second there. He took a deep breath and stated, Okay, look, I don't know who you guys are or where I even am right now, but I can speak for both parties when I say that we are all clearly freaked out over what just happened. So why don't we just take a deep breath, calm down, and try to figure this out without going crazy? I second that thought. Izuku finally became vocal. Kaken, we don't know what's going on right now or who this guy is, but let's be reasonable, end the fight here, and try to figure this out. He's at least trying to be civ. Are you saying I'm not civilized? Bakugo snapped at Izuku while letting out small explosions. Izuku freaked out while backing away and exclaimed nervously, And no, you just always rush into things and don't. Shut the hell up, shitty nerd, he snapped at Izuku again. Meanwhile, the older teen was back far away from the two teens, nearly in a corner, in a weird defensive and shocked animated stance, with an expression like he just said some form of high sacrilege. The other two teens noticed this and turned their attention to him. He stood there for a good minute before finally speaking in a fearful tone. You have moves, L like a Pokemon. That's impossible, you're human. Unless, he trailed off with a horrified expression. Did Team Plasma, Team Rocket, and the Ether Foundation join forces to make a human Pokemon hybrid? What is this world coming to? Does their insanity know no bounds? He began to rant. Izuku was more than confused at this point about whatever he was talking about. Who were Team Rock, Plasma, and the Ether Foundation? What's a Pokemon? Who's Nebi? What moves is he talking about? Bakugo, however, was not at all confused or asking any similar questions. Instead, he was even more pissed off after getting more crazy info and being ignored. A vein bulges in his head as his anger rises to new levels. First, his fight with Deku was interrupted by this purple dude who comes out of a magic wormhole. He's thrown entirely off his mojo. And now purple fucker and stupid Deku are trying to stop the fight. His fight and purple fucker was only spewing out more noise while calling him a poke whatever. Screw this. I wanted to blast shit up, so I'm gonna do it, Bakugo thought to himself while using his explosions to rocket towards him. Fuck this. I'll blast you to hell first and ask questions later, he yelled with a vicious look in his eyes. Kaken, stop, Izuku cried as he tried to halt Bakugo. Ah, mercy, the teen cried while covering his body in defense. Bakugo was only a few feet away from the older teen and ready to blow him up with a powerful blast. His smile curved into a wicked grin, his body flared with excitement, and his arms trembled with the rush of power rising to his fingertips. Just before he could ignite his quirk to the older teen's face, a small round object bounced from his belt and in front of the attack. Bakugo flinched for a moment at seeing the circular object until it exploded in a flash of bright blue light. Bakugo winced at the blinding burning sensation in his eyes, and then felt something collide with his body with such great force that it flung him clear across the room and crashed into the far opposite wall. Izuku also winched from the bright light, heard, and saw Bakugo's body fly across the room and slams into a wall. When his eyes readjusted, he saw the most amazingly terrifying thing he'd ever seen. The older teen waited for his face to get caved in by Bakugo. But when nothing happened but the sound of something slamming into a wall with great force, he dared to look out from his arm shield. He saw that the flying teen was gone, and a set of red scales wrapped around his body. He heard a triumphant roar and followed the sound up to a creature that he smiled with relief and joy. Gyarados, he squealed with joy at the massive creature. Gyarados. Is that what he called this thing? Izuku squeaked with fear in his head. The creature standing in front of them, and at the defense of the older teen, was nothing he'd seen before. Well, he had once, back when he was younger. His mother would tell him scary stories about powerful serpentine-like dragons with untold power. And this thing matched their descriptions perfectly. It was like something that came straight out of science fiction. It is a huge serpentine-like monster with armored red scales and a yellow underbelly, angry red eyes, a huge mouth filled with fangs, 2 long whiskers, and ear fins with a 3-pointed crest on its head. It also had 3 pointed fins on its back, 2 near where its head met its neck, and the last near the end of its long body with a tail fin like a fish. Izuku couldn't tell if its crest made it look mad, or it was just always looking mad. But this Gyarados thing sure did not look pleased. And seeing it made Izuku keep his eyes trained on it, frozen in place as he swallowed dryly. The older teen was not scared of the giant dragonfish. Instead, he looked overjoyed. "Boy, am I glad to see you, buddy," he exclaimed excitedly to the animal. Gyarados leaned down, letting out a low yet friendly-sounding grumble, and brought its face close to the older teen who petted it under its chin. "You saved me in the nick of time again," the older teen stated, embarrassed. Gyarados made a sound in its throat that could have been equal to laughter, as if teasing him. At this time, Bakugo pulled himself from the wall and fell to the floor with a grunt. He picked himself up on shaky legs and heavy breath and stared down the older teen, only to be thrown off guard by the giant red sea serpent cooler around him. "The fuck is that?" he shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. All heads turned to Bakugo as Gyarados turned back to the teen and defensively coiled around the older teen as it let out a mighty and bone-chilling roar in warning. Bakugo let out a small growl and stared down at the giant animal, only making it even angrier. Izuku knew there was no seeking reason with Bakugo at this point. He knew he'd try to attack despite the danger involved. So he opted to hide behind a pillar and wait things out or intervene if things got too out of hand. The older teen, looking much more confident, stated to Bakugo, "Listen here, you hybrid or whatever you are. I don't know who or what you are, but you had better stop attacking if you know what's good for you. You can't win." Bakugo snarled at this declaration and set off more explosions in his hands. "Shut the hell up. Don't you fucking tell me what to do, you purple fuck. I'll kill that shitty fish, and then you," Bakugo shouted at him. Gyarados roared again as the older teen replied calmly, "Then you leave me no choice." He took out a small round device from his belt and pointed it at Bakugo. It was spherical and colored half red and half white, and it had a black line going around it, separating the colors with a white button in the center. "I'll just have to battle, and then catch you to quell that vicious temper of yours," he stated boldly. "Don't you make fun of me," Bakugo roared as he shot towards the teen. The older teen struck a confident pose with his hand shot out in the front and exclaimed to his beast, "You ready, Gyarados?" Gyarados roared in acknowledgement. "Great. Then let's size him up with a dragon pulse," he shouted. Gyarados then closed its mouth, and when it opened back up, it shot out a multicolored beam that took a dragon-like shape that soared towards Bakugo. Bakugo used his explosions to curve around the beam and continued closing the distance between them. "You're fast, but I have the type advantage. Gyarados, use Hydro Pump," he commanded the fish dragon. Gyarados then shot out a powerful stream of water from its mouth like a cannon. The blast was much wider and faster than Dragon Pulse, and Bakugo had to halt his attack and dodge the blast by blasting himself in the opposite direction. "Let's see how you fare with a rapid-fire attack." Gyarados keeps using Hydro Pump, he shouted towards the animal. Gyarados obeyed and continued shooting multitudes of Hydro Pumps at Bakugo. Bakugo could just barely keep out of range and outpace each attack, each of which packed tremendous speed and power behind them. So much so that the ground broke apart, cut pillars in half, and gaping holes made all over, reducing concrete to mud and stones. Izuku was stunned by this sight. Not only was this thing unnatural, but it also had multiple quirks. First an energy attack, and now a water attack. What was this thing? He was also having a hard time keeping out of the firing line or just finding decent cover. Every time he would hide, a blast of water or some other attack would destroy his defense, and he would have to flee for his life to not get ripped apart. Eventually, Gyarados got tired from spitting up water and had to take a breather. Bakugo saw his chance and rocketed towards the monster in mere seconds. He then let out a few powerful explosions right into the fish's face. Gyarados roared in pain from the attack and inches back from the blast. "Gyarados, are you okay?" the older teen called the fish. Gyarados shook itself off and roared again. The older teen smiled and said, "Good to hear." When Bakugo set off his last explosions on Gyarados' face, he used the momentum to push himself into the air. He then propelled himself down with another, ready to pepper the giant fish again. "Here he comes." The older teen called attention to Bakugo. "Use thunder." Gyarados' head crest began to produce electricity and shot a bolt into the air. It curved back down and right into Bakugo's flight path. Bakugo got lucky and managed to use another explosion to propel himself back. The attack missed and made the ground underneath explode. "Hyper Beam," cried the older teen as Gyarados shot out a yellowish-white beam of energy from its mouth. This time, the attack hit Bakugo and sent him flying back. After the beam dissipated, he skidded across the floor and quickly brought himself back to his feet with a feral snarl. Gyarados hissed back and kept its defensive stance around its master. "Geez, this thing is tough. How much HP does it have?" the older teen asked himself. Bakugo then raised one of his gauntlets and pointed it at the teen and his pet. "What's it doing?" the teen asked himself. Bakugo snickered and stated, "This time, I'll blow both of you to hell." "Uh-oh," the teen pales in fear. "Now die," Bakugo yells as he pulls the pin and shoots off a deadly explosion. The older teens screamed in fear seeing as there was nowhere to escape from the blast. But Gyarados had another idea and quickly wrapped its long body around its master to shield him from the attack. The explosion quickly engulfed Gyarados' body in a plum of fire and debris within a blink. The dust cleared, and Gyarados' charred red body emerged from the smoke. The giant fish unraveled from around its master and flopped on the ground with a defeated groan. The older teen opened his eyes and saw that he was completely fine, along with the downed Gyarados. He freaked out, running to the fish's head and holding it. He begged, "No, no, no, come on, buddy, you have to get up. Please. That Pokemon is still on the loose and wah." Bakugo emerged from the smoke and collapsing building with a snide smile on his face as he stared down the older teen with one visible yes, and caused him to scream with terror. This sight made Bakugo lick his lips in anticipation as he slowly walked up to the teen and his downed animal. "Arceus, Arceus, 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 Arceus." The teen cursed as he began to shuffle wildly through his belt pouches. Bakugo then went into a full sprint, ready to blast and the teen began to panic while failing to back away due to Gyarados' body trapping him in. He looked back at the fallen form of his pet, then back to Bakugo, who was still charging him with only a few feet to close the gap. He jumped in front of the fish face with arms wide open to shield the fish from the explosion, closed his eyes, and braced himself. "Die," Bakugo shouted as he jumped into the air with a large explosion. However, instead of being hit with an explosion straight to the face, Bakugo was the one hit with a fin tail straight to the side of his body that sent him flying into the nearest wall. The teen opened his eyes and saw Bakugo jammed into the wall with a glare on his face. Gyarados' tail laying out in front of him, and Gyarados starting to pick himself back up. Gyarados lifted its body and let out a triumphant war cry. The older teen's eyes glittered with hope and joy at seeing the giant fish while exclaiming, "Gyarados, you're okay. I knew you could tough it out. You're not one of my best for nothing." Gyarados lowers its head to its master, allowing the older teen to pet the fish under its chin and behind its finned ears with a growling purr. Meanwhile, Bakugo had pulled himself away from the wall and looked even more pissed off than before. He lost off a few explosions and an angry scream, showing that he hadn't given up yet. The older teen and Gyarados looked back towards the angry, fuming younger teen and tense up, seeing as he was still not down. Even after all that, it's still kicking. What level is this thing anyway? The older teen complained. The two people and giant animals stare down at each other for several tense seconds as the older teen whispers to his pet, "Gyarados, I have an idea, but I need you to trust me." Gyarados seemed to understand its master and appeared to nod its head. The teen smiled and pointed his arm at Bakugo. He commanded, "Then get ready to battle." Gyarados roared with gusto. Bakugo charged at the teen and his pet as the older teen commanded the fish to tank the attack. Gyarados obeyed and stood perfectly still, allowing Bakugo to charge forward and land a few powerful attacks on the fish's face. Thick black smoke covered the giant animal's face as a painful screech can be heard from inside the cloud. Bakugo smiled at hearing the roar, knowing he had done a significant amount of damage to the creature. The older teen grinned, seeing Bakugo's ego flare up, just like he planned. He took advantage and shot his arm out towards him and commanded, "Now Gyarados, use Hydro Pump one last time." Suddenly, a large stream of water bursts out from the clouds and nails Bakugo head-on. Bakugo was thrown back a good several feet before he was able to push himself out of the torrent power and landed on his feet soaking wet. Bakugo growled at this and putting up his other gauntlet. He aimed to fire it one last time at the creature. But the older team expected this and waited until Bakugo pulled the pin. "Quickly, Gyarados, get rid of that explosion with Hyper Beam." The older team commanded the dragonfish. Gyarados then let out the pale yellowish energy beam and shot it into the center of the explosion. The two forces collide with such great force that they canceled each other out in a blast of smoke. Bakugo covered his eyes and tried to gain better footing from the force of the explosions exerting from both sides. But he was quickly outmaneuvered when Gyarados burst through the smoke with an angry expression and pounced on Bakugo. Gyarados quickly wrapped its body around Bakugo like a snake and held him in a restraining squeeze. Bakugo tried to break free, but to no avail as he simply flopped his head around like a fish out of water. So instead, he changed to swearing and threats. "Let me the hell go, you ugly seafood platter. I'll turn you into sashimi and blast that purple fucker into next week." He cursed them both. The older teen smiled and said, "Then let's finish this. Gyarados, finish it off with thunder." Gyarados' head crest generated electricity and shot a bolt in the air, which rolled down where Bakugo was held in its coils. Bakugo looked up with a stunned expression and marveled at the lighting in fear. The attack shot down and landed directly on Bakugo, whose screams were drowned out by the intense power. After the attack, Gyarados lets go of Bakugo, letting his body slump into the ground, and moved away as the older teen threw the round half-colored device at Bakugo. The device flew through the air and bounced right off Bakugo's head. It then popped open, and a red beam enveloped the younger teen's body. It seemed to be similar to electricity since it began to shock and cause Bakugo to convulse even further. The device fell to the ground and broke into pieces. The older teen looked at this in confusion and said, "What? It didn't work? But he's a Pokemon. He should have gone into the Pokeball. Unless he's part human, he can't be caught." He then looked out into the distance like his brain was buffering until he snapped back, exclaiming while throwing his arms in front, Then how the hell was Ether, Rocket, and Plasma going to control that thing if they couldn't catch it? Then the older teen's eyes caught someone hiding behind one of the few remaining pillars, was a set of fearful green eyes. The teen turned towards the eyes as Girato stood ready, half more relaxed around its master. But the older teen put a hand up, signaling the fish to stand down, and it did. Seeing that he wasn't going to attack, Izuku poked his head out a little more. The older teen took up an awkward and coy demeanor, while looking to the ground in a sweat drop. Seeing this, Izuku decided to come out from his hiding spot, but still kept his eyes on the giant red dragonfish. The older teen rubbed his head, while laughing nervously, and apologized. Haha. Sorry you had to see me get like that. I get pretty intense when I battle, especially with new or hard ones. Hope I didn't scare you too much. Izuku also gave a nervous laugh and replied, Haha. Yeah. I guess we should talk now. To clear the air on things, the older teen asked. Why, yeah, talk. That's what I wanted to do. Izuku trailed off, not knowing the teen's name. The older teen blushed in embarrassment and quickly introduced himself. Garfield. But everyone always calls me Gar, or Gar, or Jengar. You can call me whatever. Izuku Midoriya. Nice meeting you. Izuku introduced himself back with a slight bow. An awkward silence filled the area, as the two teens couldn't think of how to carry on their conversation from here. So, nice giant, fish, dragon, thing. Izuku tried to break the ice. The older teen pepped up a bit and replied, Oh, thanks. He's a Gyarados, and one of my oldest companions. He's helped me through a lot of battles. I owe much of my success to him, he said while petting Gyarados' scales. The teen then turned to Bakugo's still body and motioned to him. He asked, Suuo, what's up with this Pokemon? Where'd he come from? Izuku looked at him weirdly as he replied, Kakin isn't a Pokemon. And what's a Pokemon? The older teen looked back at him weirdly and stated, You're kidding, right? You have to be kidding. This, he exclaimed while waving at Bakugo. Can't be anything but a Pokemon. He was flying around and shooting F-fire from high his hands. And he took a direct blast from Hyper Beam. And I've been hit by Hyper Beam, and let me tell ya, it's not fun. Also, how could you ask what's a Pokemon when there's one, literally, right next to me? Izuku blinked at the teen and replied, That's Kakin's quirk. He can produce explosions from his hands. And also, he's definitely human. What's a quirk? Gar asked back. I think we should start explaining some things to one another, Izuku offered. Yeah, I think so too, Gar agreed with a sigh. A few hours later, in a meeting hall, Gar now sat around a table, surrounded by several heroes, all of which were asking and answering each other's questions about what in the world is going on. The mock exercise was cancelled, and all students were sent back to their homeroom until things sorted out, apart from Bakugo, who was sent to Recovery Girl for his extreme injuries. After some time of debate and questions, the group finally settled down and tried to compile everything they learned about each other in the simplest form. So let me try and see if I understand this clearly. There are no Pokemon in this world, and all Pokemon are called animals, and they don't have any moves. But instead the humans are the Pokemon, and have moves you call quirks and work as superheroes like in comic books. That is crazy, Gar exclaimed while sitting back in his seat with a flop. Yes, and let me see if I understand this clearly. In your world, your animals are called Pokemon. These Pokemon have quirks, and all of them have multiple or interchangeable quirks. But people don't, and you use Pokemon for fighting while keeping them in these Pokeball things. That's even crazier, Aizawa explained back nonchalantly. Gar immediately sat up straight and exclaimed, You're telling me. I've been to some strange alternate dimensions before, but this place beats 'em all. So you've done this sort of thing before? Midnight asked. Gar nodded and replied, Oh yeah, loads of times. But like I said, I've never seen a place like this. Something must have happened during the trip. He theories while tapping his chin. How exactly did you get here? You say you're quirkless, yet you're able to travel between dimensions, Present Mike asked. Well, technically, I'm not the one who does the traveling. Nebi does. Gar confirmed. Who's Nebi? All Might inquired. He's a legendary ultra beast that can evolve. He was kept hostage by a crazed woman who was obsessed with gaining knowledge of other ultra beasts. I went to another dimension with a crazed woman's daughter, after Nebi evolved, and fought her as she merged with another ultra beast and beat her in a battle in the ultra beast's home dimension, Gar explained to the heroes. All the heroes sitting around the table stare and blink multiple times at the young man with confused expressions, trying to make sense of what he just said, as if he had just grown a third head. Realizing his explanation, he blushed, embarrassed, and rubbed his head. He said, I realize now that there is a lot to unpack in that. But for the sake of simplicity, let's just say he's a really powerful Pokemon that travels between dimensions. Wow, Present Mike whistles. Wow indeed, Gar confirmed. So did you come here on purpose when you and Nebi were traveling? Midnight asked. Gar took a sharp breath and, putting up both hands under his chin, he explained. Well, actually, that's a story all on its own. You see, I was in Galar. After I had held my title as champion for the umpteenth time, I set out to do other things. Fill the Pokédex, complete my Curry Dex, catch every Pokemon in Galar, Ev, and Roman 4 breeding, and get all forms and flavors of alchemy. But then I got bored again and decided to go traveling to visit some old friends. First, I traveled to Alola and met my old friend Hal Ware. Gar was then cut off by Aizawa, who butted in, saying, Could you just skip to the part where you got to our world? Gar's sweat dropped in embarrassment. Oh right, sorry. Anyway, Hal said that he could out-eat any man or Pokemon in a Malasada eating contest. And he was right. So he decided to test his skills against something that wasn't a man or Pokemon and wanted to compete against Nebi, who is, but actually isn't a Pokemon. It's kind of weird. Anyway, I don't know how he convinced me, but I agreed. And then the two started to eat while I was sitting on Nebi's back to keep him calm in case things went south. And well, things did go south, and real quick too. I shouldn't have let Nebi eat bitter Malasada cause then he started to go wild from the taste. He started to randomly open ultra wormhole portals all over the place and jumped into one, going at speeds I've never seen him go before. He booted me off, and I got sucked outside the ultra stream and into a weird wormhole I've never seen before. And now I'm here, he explained casually. All the heroes were silent as they digested this information and tried to make some sense of it, as most of it was a lot of things they never heard of before. That and the fact it sounded so absurd. Suddenly the door opened, and a new voice chimed into the silence, saying Farshalt, Well, that does sound like quite the adventure and conundrum you got yourself into, young man. All heads swiveled to the door and saw the hyper-intelligent animal thing, Principal Mezu standing in the doorway, finally coming to the meeting after having to take care of some other urgent business. Nezu straightened his tie and introduced himself, saying, Hello there, I am. Before he could continue, Gar shot up from his seat and whipped out a Pokeball and screamed, while pointing to Nezu, A Pokemon. Gar threw the device at the small animal, and the same thing that happened with Bakugu happened with Nezu. The device opened, and a red beam enveloped him, which caused an electric shock to run over his body and convulse from it. When it failed to catch the principal, the device fell to the ground and broke into pieces. Gar stared blankly at this before realizing what happened and theorized. Oh, I guess you're not a Pokemon, huh? Nezu stood up while brushing himself off, and in the nicest, most patient tone he could manage, he confirmed, No, I'm not. Gar rubbed the back of his head, embarrassed, and apologized, saying, Sorry about that. I'm a trainer, so when I see a new Pokemon, I kind of freak out and try to catch it. But I mean, you do look like a weird shiny Rattata in a tux. After fixing his tie again, Nezu then replied, well, not all of us are okay with being beaten to near exhaustion, forcefully placed in a small prison, and then forced to fight other creatures to the death for the entertainment of others. And let's not forget the Stockholm Syndrome. Everyone in the room made a shocked expression as the principal roasted the young man until the young man walked up to Nezu with a ticked-off expression and pinched his nose hard. Ouchie, Nezu complained. Gar then took a deep breath to calm himself and ranted off on the animal, saying, okay, I'm not even sure where I should begin with you. First, you have to weaken a Pokemon to catch it. It's the only way. I tried to catch a Pidgey without weakening it first, and I still regret it. Second, a Pokeball is not a prison. It's a holding device. The Pokemon's matter is converted into energy. They're more like in a comfortable sleep-like state. Third, Pokemon battles are an international sport that has strict rules, guidelines, and regulations. Fourth, Pokemon don't fight to the death, and they only fight until they pass out. And speaking of which, that's quite hypocritical coming from someone who delights in setting up events where young children fight in a ring with deadly abilities, pinning them against one another, fighting them yourselves, and sending them off to fight other stronger adults. And fifth, there is no Stockholm Syndrome. That's just a myth. When a Pokemon is caught, they immediately become tame enough to receive commands, and they still have free will to do what they want, when they want. And I can't tell you how many times I literally asked a Pokemon to just join me on my journey. Everyone in the room was now making shocked expressions at the sweating principal, who just got roasted back with cold hard facts for an adolescent. Nezu cleared his throat and replied calmly, I, see your point. A cold and awkward silence filled the room at this point until Aizawa, who was the only one to care less about the current atmosphere, struck back up the conversation, asking Gar, so, time to ask the big question. Are you able to get back to your home dimension? Gar slumped back into his seat, and with a solemn headshake and anxious expression, he replied, I'm afraid not. Only Nebi or Lunala can travel in between dimensions. He then took off 6 different-looking Pokeballs from around his belt and placed them on the table, saying, and the Pokemon I have with me can't do any of that. So I guess I'm stuck. This time Midnight broke the atmosphere, placing a reassuring hand on Gar's shoulder and asking Rizoshae, is there really no way for you to contact your friends or Nebi to come pick you up? Gar looked off to the side and replied, there is one way, but it's not working. He then slumped down even further into his seat, and giving off an exhausted sigh, he continued, I could pull Nebi or Lunala from my PC, but my Pokebox is not working. Gar then pulled out a large, unusual-looking device from one of his pouches. It looked like a thick frisbee made of glass with a handle on top and a small metallic screen on the front with several buttons. He pressed one of the buttons and the whole thing extended upward until it was at least 2 feet tall. It had glass all around and 3 separate gray dividers with small indents around each one where a Pokeball is placed. It had an invisible sliding door mechanism that opened automatically. Gar sighed and said, deep ocean floors, dark caves, thick jungles, endless deserts, or the highest mountain peaks. This thing will work without fail. But I guess alternate dimensions are its limit. Another round of silence was set into the melancholy atmosphere until Present Mike asked out of the blue, wait, so you keep your pocket monsters in a PC? Yes, Gar answered. Like a computer? He asked again. Yes, Gar replied while sweat dropping a bit. A PC computer? He asked further. Yes, Gar stated firmly with an aggravated sigh, having to say the same thing over and over. That doesn't make any sense, he exclaimed in confusion. Gar rolled his eyes and explained. The Pokeballs convert matter into energy. Who's to say that matter can't also be converted to data? And besides, there are like 1,000 different Pokemon. You really think I'm going to carry around like 1,000 different Pokeballs all the time? No one said anything but opted to just stare at the young man. Seeing this, Gar sighed and continued on. The limit that anyone can carry is about 6. Otherwise, they're sent to their personal PC. And the 6 that I currently have. Gar motioned to the 6 different pokeballs on the table. Can't perform interdimensional travel. So I'm pretty much stuck, like a shelter on a slowpoke tail. Gar slumped into his seat again until Nezu spoke up, causing the young man to straighten out at his voice. Well, seeing as all things have come to light, it would be in everyone's best interest if you were to stay here at UA until you're able to travel back to your world, he told the teen. What? Everyone in the room asked the principal with mixed confusion and surprise. Well, it would be quite heartless of us to throw you out into a world you simply have no knowledge of. And it would go against everything we at UA stand for, Nezu explained further. So you're gonna let me stay, so you can keep an eye on me to make sure I don't decide to use my murderous magic beasts to slay all of you and conquer your world? Gar asked while making funny hand gestures and faces. In a manner of speaking, yes. Nezu replied nonchalantly. Fair enough. Gar shrugged his shoulders in agreement. After that was settled, Gar deviated from the topic and stated, speaking of which, sorry about nearly obliterating one of your students. The one with the bad temper and fire hands. Nezu waved his apology off and replied, it's quite all right. Mistakes happen. And you were simply defending yourself when young Katsukui attacked you unprovoked. After he heals up, we'll be sure to have a strict talk about unprofessional hero behavior. The other teachers also nodded, knowing that Bakugo would be handled accordingly. Gar then deviated from the topic again and asked, speaking of healing, what have you guys got in the line of a poke center? Ah, poke center, All Might asked. Gar sighed and replied in a sweat drop. I think we still have some things to discuss. The next day, everyone in Class 1 was abuzz with excitement as they all crowded around the otherworldly person who joined their class. It was decided that Gar would join the hero course of 1A in order to better hide his other dimensional origin and Pokemon from the rest of the school and the watchful eye of the media because the whole class witnessed Bakugo's fight against Gar and Gyarados. So the day following the botched mock hero villain exam, Gar arrived at 1A in an official UA uniform with Aizawa, albeit with his purple and black headband. After Aizawa explained Gar's placement, he had to step out for a bit to take care of some last-minute things. Right after he left, the whole class sprung up from their seats and surrounded the older teen, asking him all kinds of questions or just marveling at him. Things like who he was, where he came from, what his world was like, what Pokemon are and how powerful they are, what he does, what's his favorite color, and so on and so forth. Eventually, Ida had to forcefully separate the class from the overwhelmed teen and regain some form of structure in the class before another Pokemon burst out and decided to attack them. Most of the class listened, but a few still pressed on despite the logical demand. Until Gar broke them away, lying, saying he could already feel Gyarados' Pokeball start to shake. And seeing what the fish monster did yesterday, the rest of them didn't want to be caught up in what happened to Bakugo. After everyone spread out a bit, allowing Gar some much-needed breathing room, Ida fixed his glasses and instructed the class. Now I know all of you are just as excited as I am about Gar-kun's placement. But let's try to have some semblance of order so as not to overwhelm him. He's in a completely new world with rules and laws he doesn't know, so let's try to help him acclimate while he's here. Sorry, Ida-kun. It's just so exciting. You know? Uraraka apologized while rubbing the back of her head. It's not every lifetime when you get to meet a real-life alien, Kaminari exclaimed with sparkles in his eyes. I'm human, Gar commented. You know what I mean. Kaminari shot back, making Gar frown. Yeah, I mean, you were all like Wasei, and Wham, and Boom, and your giant fish was like Roar, and lasers, and water cannons, and thunder, and wow. Mina described what happened like an excited child. Gar rubbed the back of his head, embarrassed, and replied, "Thanks. But his name is Gyarados, and I really didn't do that much. I just told him what to do." But I don't think someone else was very impressed about it. Gar motioned towards Bakugu sitting in the background. Bakugu, for the most part, was healed up with a few patches and gauze wrappings on his body and face. He was still in his seat, slumped into it, and looking away from everyone else with an angry scowl. "Oh, come on, man. No need to sulk. Accidents happen." Kirishima tried to cheer him up. "Accidents? Accidents? You weren't the one blasted by a laser, doused in high-pressure water, constricted, and then blasted with lightning." Bakugu snapped back while exploding in his seat. "You did attack him unprovoked. It was self-defense on his part." Gyro stated matter-of-factly. No, he's right. I did go a bit overboard. But that's mostly because I thought he was a weird Pokemon." Gar waved off Gyro while walking towards Bakugu and extending his hand. "Since we'll be seeing each other more often now, let's put this behind us and start fresh," Gar offered with a smile. Bakugu looked down at his hand, grabbed it, and in an instant flung the older teen over his shoulder and hard on the ground. Gar gasped for air as pain shot up his back and head. The class gasped, and Ida ran forward to restrain Bakugu, while Izuku and Uraraka ran to Gar to help him back up. "Bakugu-san, please, I understand you're upset after getting beaten. But that's no excuse to attack him out of petty anger. Especially after he tried to make peace with you. And right after our teachers gave you a meeting about appropriate hero behavior. For shame." Ida told him off. Bakugu struggled against the taller teen's stronger grip and cursed him out, shouting, "Fuck off, Four Eyes. The purple fucker had it coming. And I'm not a fucking Pokemon. Could have fooled me." Gar squeaked out in pain while trying to sit up. "Knowing the moral code of Team Rocket, Plasma, and the Ether Foundation, I wouldn't be surprised that they did make you. I heard you mention something about that yesterday." "Who are they?" Izuku asked Gar, while helping him into a chair. "Team Rocket, Team Plasma, and the Ether Foundation. They're groups of evil organizations or teams that have done pretty rotten things to Pokemon in the past. But I managed to put an end to them all," Gar explained. "What things did they do to Pokemon that was so bad?" Uraraka asked. Gar blew out air, like it was a heavy topic, and replied, "Boy, where do I begin? Team Rocket is a team of thieves who believe that Pokemon are meant to serve their organization, making money off of rare Pokemon and their parts. Even stealing things used to evolve, capture, and heal Pokemon. They were even stealing endangered Pokemon themselves from the wild and trainers alike. They even went so far as to clone a Pokemon," Gar told the class. "Clone," one person exclaimed in shock. "A Pokemon?" another person questions. Gar nodded his head and explained, "Yup, the original was a Pokemon called Mew. Team Rocket found its DNA in the jungles, and then hired some twisted scientist to make an even more powerful clone. After many failed experiments, Mutwo was born, and they made it powerful, too powerful. They tried to restrain it by warping its memories, but that only made things worse. It became savage and cruel, then broke out of its prison and killed its creators." "Holy shit," one person exclaimed. "That's terrible," a girl shouted. Gar quickly retaliated by saying, "But it's fine now. I dethroned the leader of Team Rocket twice and caught Mutwo, making him much more calm and tame." After everyone calmed down from the shocking info, Zero asked, "So what about this Team Plasma?" Gar snapped his fingers and explained, "Oh, them. You know, out of all the teams I met, they're the ones who I thought were simultaneously the most logical and second craziest." "Second?" someone asked. Gar waved off the comment while saying, "A story for another time." Anyway, Team Plasma was hell-bent on liberating Pokemon from humankind, seeing humans as harmful to the existence of Pokemon. In a way, they had a point, but went about it in the worst way possible. So they tried to use the power of 3 legendary Pokemon, in order to subjugate the whole region in a tyrannical monarchy rule. If that wasn't bad enough, they did something similar to what Team Rocket did to Mutwo. One person gasped at this and asked anxiously, "They cloned a Pokemon too?" Gar's sweat dropped as everyone inches closer to his face, and he answered, No, they augmented a Pokemon." "Augment? Like giving a new part to the original?" someone asked. Gar took a deep breath and replied, "Let me explain. They revived a fossil of an ancient Pokemon and then augmented it with technology, completely morphing its body, physiology, typing, basically everything about it. Essentially turning it into a different species altogether. They even grafted a cannon to its biology." "Sounds like RoboCop," Kaminari commented. "But I managed to stop them like I did Team Rocket." Gar followed up. Uraraka visibly quivered and stated, "Geez, I don't think I even want to know about Etha at this point." Gar glanced over to the side as he said, "Well, they're even worse." "How?" everyone shouted as they got into his face in suspense. "They did everything that Team Rocket and Plasma did, and more." Gar answered as calmly as he could, warranting Ida to hold everyone back again. After things settled down again, Gar explained further. The Etha Foundation was a huge pseudo-island paradise that acted as a reserve and research center for injured or endangered Pokemon. Though it held many dark secrets behind it, its CEO was completely obsessed with finding these super rare and powerful Pokemon called Ultra Beasts. Its head scientist successfully created 3 Pokemon with something called the RK system, allowing it to become any type and most suited to fight against Ultra Beasts. But they were too powerful and had to be restrained. "Suuo, did they clone or augment the Pokemon?" someone asked carefully. Gar shook his head and replied, "Worse, they made a Pokemon." Everyone gasped as Gar explained further. "From what I read about them, they're a conglomerate of different Pokemon parts put together. They didn't just take an original and upgrade it. They made something completely different. A Frankenstein's monster among Pokemon." A hushed gasp fell over the whole class upon hearing this. "Oh my god, could they be any worse?" Momo gasped in horror. Gar then put his hands under his chin while sucking in a sharp breath of air. Gyro saw this and asked in exasperation, "Please tell me you're joking." Gar gave a quick sigh before explaining. The CEO of the Etha Foundation was actually a wolf in sheep's clothing, appearing nice, helpful, caring, and sweet, but in reality was a cold, warped, cruel person. She even went so far as to abuse her own kids and treat them as toys. She also used the Pokemon she rescued to make the Arceus Pokemon, and the ones she felt were the cutest or prettiest she would lock away in frozen, suspended animation, even having a trophy room for her to admire. "That's sick," someone exclaimed with a nauseous tone. "But you stopped them, right?" another asked anxiously. Gar nodded and replied, "I did. But the more I learned about why the CEO did what she did, the more I actually started to pity her." "What?" the whole class shouted at him. "How could you say that? From what you told us, this woman is vile to the core and evil in all manner of ways. So how could you pity her?" Mina shouted at the older teen while grabbing his shoulders. She lost her mind and her loved one. This statement made everyone go silent as they back away from him, and Gar continued explaining. Lusamine and her husband Moan discovered the Ultra Wormholes, Ultra Beasts, and Ultra Dimensions. It was their combined efforts that allowed them to make these discoveries. They even managed to get their hands on a very docile Ultra Beast called Cosmog. But something went wrong. I don't know all the details, but something happened, and an Ultra Wormhole sucked up Moan, who disappeared forever. Lusamine lost her mind due to stress and to the desire to make something to combat the Ultra Beasts if they did invade. Her heart might have been in the right place, but her head has long since lost. And I barely managed to help her daughter scrape up what remained of their relationship to build back together. No one said a word. Only silence lingered in the air at his statement. It was hard to hear, but reasonable to accept. Losing your loved one plus extreme desire turning into obsession would lead most people to become completely mad. Wow, that's really sad, one person said softly. Yes, but that still doesn't excuse the things she did. Another added. But enough about that, let's talk about me. Bust. A new voice shouted as a floating orange smartphone with a face shot out from behind Gar's back. Ah, talking phone. Kirishima screamed in fear until his fear vanished as he realized what he said and rebuttal excitedly, saying, No, wait. Cool, talking phone. Gar, who or what is this? Yuriroka pointed to the self-flying phone. Oh, this is, Gar began to speak until he cut off. Hello everyone, my name is Rotom. I am Garfield's personal assistant and his most handsome, most intelligent, most amazing friend, Bust. The phone, Rotom, introduced himself in a self-absorbed flamboyant manner, while spinning around in the air. Rotom appeared to be a phone with its face on the back. It was colored orange with two small lightning bolts sticking out on the top and bottom. It glowed an outline of blue with a toothy smile and unusual-looking white eye rings with blue centers. And most obnoxiously egotistical, Gyro said to herself. Is that a Pokemon? One person asked. Gar nodded and replied. Yep, Rotom is a Pokemon. Come on out of my phone for a minute. Suddenly, an orange bolt of lightning shot out of the phone, and the device fell out of the air and into Gar's hand. The phone now looked like a regular black smartphone. The lighting manifested into an unusual light bulb-looking creature with the same coloration, hue, eyes, and smile of the phone. Though this time, it had two blue lighting bolt-sharp appendages sprouting from either side. It also appeared to buzz and fizz around, almost glitching, like it couldn't sit still. Whoa, one person exclaimed. So cool, another commented. So cute, another added with a coo. It looks like electricity, another observed. Izuku moved towards Rotom, with huge, exciting, sparkly eyes, and stated, You're so cool, Rotom. Rotom smiled back, while making many electrical noises. Izuku was taken aback by this and asked Gar, Why isn't he talking? He can't talk unless he's in my phone. You see, Rotom is a ghost electric type, which means he can possess electrical devices. Even his typing, moves, and stats change depending on what he possesses. He explained. He doesn't look like a ghost. One person observed. Gar shrugged, while looking to the side and replied. Well, Pokemon typings can be a bit blurred at times. There's a bird Pokemon that's also a dragon type. And it's just like why. So, is he part of your team? One person asked. Gar shook his head and replied. Nope, Rotom serves a completely different function. I got him as a gift from a close friend. Gar held up his phone and said, Come on back it, buddy. Rotom smiled, and, in an instant, shot himself back into the phone like a bolt of lightning. Rotom's face appeared back on the phone, while also taking back its coloration, and sighed with relief, saying, Ah, it's much more comfortable inside your phone. Buzzed. Rotom here is actually a special case in terms of his kind. He doesn't just possess technology. He upgrades it too. Gar explained excitedly. Like how? Someone asked. Gar tapped his chin while thinking and answered. Well, I'm glad you asked. Bust. Rotom cut it off, getting in front of his face. I'm a phone with unlimited texting and talking, Wi-Fi and hotspot capabilities, a built-in firewall, internet surfing, direct TV to video streaming functions, a built-in camera, GPS, hacking, decoding algorithm, facial and fingerprint recognition. I double as a Pokédex and can check moves, typing, stats, and record data on Pokemon. Buzzed. I have everything. Buzzed. He listed off his achievements in a face-rubbing manner. Gar nodded and added, Yeah, Rotom has been a real big help and saving grace in my most recent journey. Kaminari, then scooted up to Gar and excitedly asked, "Hey, can you show that giant dragonfish thing on Rotom? The one that wiped the floor with Bakugo?" Gar sighed at his phrasing and corrected him, saying, "Again, he's called a Gyarados and sure." Gar turned to Rotom and asked, "Rotom, pull up info on Gyarados." Rotom then faced the class with his screen, and an app titled Pokédex opened. A moment later, a picture of Gyarados showed up as Rotom read its entry aloud. Gyarados, the atrocious Pokémon. Dex #130. A water and flying type. And the evolved form of Magikarp. When Magikarp evolves into Gyarados, its brain cells undergo a structural transformation. It is said that this transformation is to blame for this Pokemon's wildly violent nature. Bust. Everyone crowded around the floating phone as they oohed and awed at the info and Rotom's capabilities. Then someone pointed out something, asking, "Is your Gyarados sick or something?" Gar looked at the person confused, and shaking his head, he replied, No, why? Because the one in this picture is blue, not red like yours." The person asked while pointing to the primary coloration on its body. Gyarados are naturally blue. Bust. Garfield's Gyarados is a rare variant called a shiny. Buzzed. They're the same Pokemon, but in a different color. Buzzed. Rotom explained. "Whoa, that's super wicked, dude," one person exclaimed. "So manly," another agreed. "That's good, right?" one person asked. "How'd you get it?" Izuku asked Gar. Gar rubbed the back of his head and replied, "Haha. That's a story for another day." Before anyone could comment more or ask for another story, one of the pokeballs on Gar's belt began to shake. Gar saw this, and, sweating, he said in a loud voice, "Uh-oh." Everyone saw what Gar meant and immediately scurried away from him, thinking that Gyarados would pop out and nearly crush them all in the small classroom with its huge body. The pokeball opened up, and a flash of blue light poured out and manifested a much smaller shape, small enough to fit on Gar's desk. The matter took form and into an unusual creature, no bigger than a plushie. The creature looked far more like a toy than an animal, as its body seemed to be made of old, worn, washed-out cloth. Its head was big and lumpy and swung around like a puppet on a string. It had 2 long bent ears that were colored black at the tips, and its face was painted with 2 black eyes, 2 red cheeks, and a squiggly smile. All the drawn-on parts were extremely sloppy. It had a tail made of wood shaped like a lightning bolt. Upon closer inspection, it appeared that it wasn't a toy, but a creature wearing a disguise, as its actual body just peeked out from under the sheet. It even had 2 very small black dotted eyes right under the false head, where the chest would be. "Mimikyu," cried the odd creature. Gar smiled joyfully at the creature and stated happily, "Oh, Mimikyu, what are you doing out of your ball?" "Who's that Pokemon?" one person asked in a creeped-out tone. "Ugh, it's super creepy looking," one person garaged in a disgusted tone. "It is kinda scary," one person stated fearfully. "Why is it wearing a puppet?" one person asked cautiously. "What's wrong with it?" another asked with a mix of fear and disgust in their tone. Gar then made a shocked expression and scooped the small creature into his arms. While jumping out of his seat, he exclaimed, "Haven't you Scraggy ever heard of the saying, if you don't have anything nice to say, then don't say anything?" Everyone looked at Gar with a confused expression until Kaminari voiced his 2 cents and said, "What's the big deal, dude? I mean, they're not wrong. It is kinda creepy and ugly looking. It's just an observation." Gar turned to Kaminari with red hate in his eyes. In one hand, he snuggled Mimikyu into his body, and with the other, he punched Kaminari straight in the jaw. Everyone gasped at this as Kaminari hit the floor, only to pop back up and complain in a shout, "Oh, dude, what the heck?" Gar, who still kept his furious expression, held out Mimikyu and shouted back in demand, "I demand that all you Mudbray apologize to precious Mimi at once." Everyone was immediately taken aback by Gar's attitude shift. For him to go from a serious yet kind adorable guy to violent and demanding was something to behold. Until Gyro piped up with her apathetic tone and stated, "Why? It's not exactly the prettiest thing to look at. We have plenty of animals in our world that aren't nice to look at. What's the difference with one Pokemon that wears a creepy, ugly rag?" Gar turned towards Gyro with the same furious expression and punched her square in the jaw. Yet again, everyone gasped at this as Gyro hit the floor, only to pop back up and complain in a shout. "Oh." Gar turned away from the class and exclaimed, "Can all of you be any more heartless?" The room then went silent as they heard a very small weeping noise. Everyone looked for the source and saw Mimikyu burying its real face into Gar's shirt as it started to go moist with tears. Gar whipped his head to the class with a hateful glare, causing everyone to freeze or back away. "Now look what you mudbrays did. Mimi is crying. It's okay, Mimikyu. Don't listen to those stupid Nidoqueens. I'll always think you're the greatest." Gar held Mimikyu into its shoulder like a child and rubbed its back, cooing softly to it. "None of you could ever understand how hard it is to be Mimikyu." Silence filled the room from the dramatics until Katsuki, who couldn't care less about all this, piped up and asked, "Okay, I'll bite. Why are you getting so defensive over it?" Gar looked to Rotom, who gave Gar a silent nod. Rotom floated to the class and pulled up a picture of Mimikyu while reading its data. Mimikyu, the disguise Pokemon. A fairy and ghost type. Dex #778. It hides its hideous body underneath a rag made to look like Pikachu in order to gain love and affection from others. If the neck on its disguise is broken, it'll stand in front of a mirror all day trying to fix it. But it's extremely difficult, so it'll be crying on the inside. If any harm comes to its rag, it'll spend tireless hours of the night trying to fix it. No one said a peep at hearing its info, as there was nothing to say or could be said. Until one person popped up in a saddened tone and said, "That's really sad." "Shit," one person said, while covering their mouth in shock. Gar nodded with an angry huff and exclaimed, "Yeah, well maybe now you heartless jellicents will learn not to judge by appearance alone." And apologized to Mimikyu. He demanded of the class while holding out Mimikyu towards them. Upon seeing the class staring at him, Mimikyu squeaked in fear and wiggled out of Gar's grasp, jumped onto his arm, ran the length of it, and jumped into his body while burying his true face into his neck like a frightened child. However, this reaction only made Gar glare even harder. No one attempted to make a move or say anything with the combined force of Gar's furious glare and Mimikyu crying like a hysterical child. Uraraka, surprisingly, was the first to approach and say to the little creature, "We're sorry for judging you so harshly, Mimikyu." Mimikyu stopped crying and looked up from Gar's neck with a tear-stained face. "Yeah, it's not your fault you're so ugly that you have to dress in the dark, not to scare yourself," Zero added in, only to get a sharp jab in the ribs by Momo. "Oh, what he means is, we should have gotten to know why you do what you do before coming up with a conclusion," Momo corrected Zero's explanation. "Can you ever forgive us?" Shoji asked. Uraraka spread out both her hands as if waiting for Mimikyu's decision. Also, she had no idea how to ask for confirmation from it. Mimikyu switched position from Gar's neck to his shoulder as he looked at the girl's hands. Mimikyu looked up and down at the hands, then arched itself back and kept into the air. Mimikyu then landed on Uraraka's chest, sprouted two thin, black arms with 3 fingers, and wrapped them around her face where the small animal began to snuggle her. Gar's expression immediately turned back to normal at this sight, and with a small chuckle, he said, "You're lucky Mimikyu is very forgiving. You know, now that I've gotten to know what Mimikyu is all about, he's actually kinda cute," Uraraka stated while hugging the small creature. "Yeah, creepy cute," Mina cheered. "Like a dark chocolate truffle," Toru added. Gar giggled at the sight of all the girls and some of the guys surrounding Mimikyu and showering him in affection while saying, "Careful guys, Mimikyu really likes attention. and might smother you back if he gets too excited. Mimikyu looked so much happier as he waved his little arms around and bounced in place. And his fairy typing makes him even cuter. Ribbit, Tsuyu said with a slight croak. How is that even a fairy doesn't even look like a fairy? Sato asked. I believe it fits Mimikyu perfectly, Tokoyagami answered, causing everyone to look at the bird-headed teen for an explanation. The Fae of ancient stories tell of powerful, mysterious, and twisted creatures that masquerade in the guise of beautiful, otherworldly helpers of the forest, when in fact, they wore a mask that concealed the darkness underneath each Fae. He said like a gothic poet, making everyone's sweat drop awkwardly. Despite his wording, he's not entirely wrong about fairies. Gar added in. What? The whole class exclaimed. Well, fairy-type Pokemon are known for being not only pretty and cute-looking, but also extremely dangerous or malicious. They're the bane of dragon-type Pokemon for a reason. Gar explained further. Well, I don't care. I think Mimikyu could do no wrong. Can you? No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. Mina picked up the Pokemon and made a baby voice. Come on, Bakugu-kun. It's your turn to hold Mimikyu. Uraraka stated as Mina's eyes glittered, while pushing the Pokemon towards the angry ash blonde who sat in the corner and tried to ignore everyone else. Fuck no. Get it away from me, Bakugu yelled, while trying to keep the Pokemon away from him. Come on, bro. You know you wanna. Kirishima tried to invite him. Get lost, shitty hair, he shouted at the red-haired teen. Come on, Bakugu-kun, hold the baby. Mina encouraged him. What's wrong with you idiots? He shouted at all of them. Come on, burp the baby, Toru chirped in with a giggle. All while Mimikyu tried to reach its surprisingly long arms towards Bakugu, like a child looking to be held, while letting out a small cute burp. Minta looked skeptically at Mimikyu, who stared back and said, if what Tokoyagami said is true, then what's Mimikyu's big dirty secret behind its mask? It's a little too ugly for others to look at it. Boo-hoo, he mocked while picking the small Pokemon from Mina's hands while saying, why don't we have a look for ourselves? Just as Minta was about to look under Mimikyu's rag, Rotom let off a loud, ear-piercing warning siren that caused Minta to stop momentarily. While Gar came out to the side of him, punched him square in the jaw, and ripped Mimikyu from his grasp. Minta flew quite easily from the punch, and after hitting the floor, he shot up, expecting to see Gar's furious face and wonder what he did to deserve it, only to see something much different. Gar did not look furious at him. In fact, he looked terrified. He was pale, eyes wide, body shaking, sweating bullets, and breathing heavily. Don't do that, ever. He pointed his finger at him in a dead serious tone. What the? Why? Why did you just punch me? Minta retaliated in anger once he broke out of the shock. Suddenly Rotom came next to Minta with Mimikyu's info pulled up and said, if anything tries to look under Mimikyu's disguise, it'll lash out violently. It is said that once a scholar looked under Mimikyu's rag and saw the horror underneath. That very night he died a slow, painful death. Bust. Minta waved it off aloud and said, oh come on. You don't really believe that, do you? He asked in the last part, a bit worried. Gyro twirled her ear jacks and offered. I don't know. From what we saw Gyarados do alone, who's to say Mimikyu's true form can also kill you from looking at it? With all this drama going on, especially since he was roped into it from time to time, Bakugu was royally pissed off and voiced his aggravation. Why do you shitty extras even care about some stupid animal anyway? Why care about any of them? They're just like our animals, just with quirks. There's nothing fucking special about them or any bitch who owns them. He spat. Gar gave a smug look over to Bakugu and shot back with an even smugger tone. Is that jealousy I smell wafting from your words? Bakugu whipped his head towards him with a tick already showing on his head and shouted back. Like hell I'm jealous of you, purple fucker. I don't care about your op shit eating animals or how you make them your bitches. Gar smiled vexingly at his answer and offered, "Okay, I see where this is going. I know people like you. After you've tasted an unsatisfactory defeat, you want to test your mettle again to see if you can topple or stand on even ground, right? So let's have it your way in battle." Bakugo smiled wickedly and punched a small explosion. He exclaimed excitedly, "So you finally want to have a proper punch out, eh? Well, that sounds fucking dandy to me. I'll beat you anytime, anywhere with." Before he could finish, Gar slapped his hand over his mouth as he butted in, saying, "Perhaps I should be more specific. I meant that the two of us have a Pokemon battle and—" Bakugo ripped his hand off and cut in, saying, "I'll fight any of your stupid animals." Gar covered his mouth with his other hand, getting a bit more annoyed, and clarifying, "No, no, no. I meant we are going to battle with Pokemon. To the death," Bakugo shouted while ripping off his other hand, with fire in his eyes. "Enough," Gar shouted into his face, causing everyone to go silent. Gar calmed down while pushing back his hair and continued saying, "Okay, look, in my world, most disputes are settled with Pokemon battles. Trainers never get physical with each other. Come to think of it, no one really does. And there is no to the death magic crap." "Got it." Bakugo nodded his head, surprisingly, in silence. "We'll do a simple 1v1 battle. We'll each have one Pokemon, and whoever defeats the other wins. Sounds good." This time Bakugo got back his voice as he declared boastfully, "Hell yeah, I'll beat you at your own shitty animal fighting game." Gar smiled, and taking the 6 different Pokeballs from his belt, he placed them on a desk, along with Mimikyu, who stood behind his Pokeball. Spreading his hands around the devices, he explained, "Okay, the 6 Pokeballs before you hold the 6 Pokemon I currently have with me in this world. You are allowed to choose anyone you like." However, before he could continue, even though his words were being listened to by his opponent, Bakugo snagged a Pokeball and declared, "I want this one. It looks fucking powerful." The Pokeball Bakugo held was slightly different from the normal Pokeball. It was still round with a black divided line and activation button, but the top half was black with 2 yellow lines. Gar blinked at his quick decision and stated, "You don't even know which one that is. I still haven't even told you about them and which typing." "I don't care. Let's fight, bitch." Bakugo cut him off impatiently. Gar raised a skeptical eyebrow and asked, "Are you sure you want that one? 'Cause I still have to explain." "Less talk and more beating to death," Bakugo barked at him. Gar shrugged with a sigh, and taking his own, he said, "Okay, then I'm gonna choose this one if that all right with." Gar said while taking a normal-looking Pokeball. Bakugo was already at his limit with waiting and snapped at the older teen. "Enough wasting time, and let's get to the part where I whip you. I'll beat any animal you have with this one, and this one alone." Gar shrugged, and standing up, he said aloud, "Alrighty then." Bakugo was about to throw the ball when Gar quickly grabbed his arm and exclaimed, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa. What do you think you're doing?" Bakugo looked at him weirdly and replied, "I'm gonna fight you with a monster, duh." Gar shook his finger like a disapproving mother and stated, "No, no, 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 no. We are battling outside. You have no idea how destructive they can be, especially in closed spaces. And they're called Pokemon, not monsters. But we can't go outside. Mr. Aizawa will be back soon, and school has already started. We'll get in huge trouble," Izuku stressed to them, knowing full well what he was referring to. Gar petted Izuku's head like a stressed animal and replied, "Relax, Izuku. We won't get in trouble. We're just, taking an intellectual break. You guys don't have to come. Me and Katsuki will duke it out and be back before you know it. And if we get caught, then the blame can be placed on me. You can just say that I instigated it and used my Malamur to mind control you. They can't kick me out, Suuya." "Are you coming, purple fucker, or what?" Bakugo asked in a raised voice, as he was already at the front door, ready to leave with Pokeball in hand. "That's not my name, Katsuki, and yes," Gar answered while following him out the door, as Mimikyu jumped on his shoulder and Rotom followed up behind while floating. Soon as the two teens left, everyone else followed them out and into a much more spacious area for them to have a proper Pokemon battle. Boy, was this going to be something else. After a few minutes of sneaking around the school and doing their best to avoid being seen by other classes or teachers, the entirety of Class 1 class finally made it to the gym beta. "This is a horrible idea. We should just get back to class before Aizawa-sensei knows we're gone. Can't we just do this after school hours?" Ida stressed to the group as they entered the gym. The class ignored the uptight teen as they all meandered around finding seats at the bleachers, while Gar admired the whole gym, walking around aimlessly, head turned upwards, never looking at the same spot for more than a second, like a kid in a candy store. "Man, this place is perfect for a Pokemon battle, especially for our types," he proudly stated while admiring the tall ceilings and wide-open floor plan. "You're not even listening to me," Ida shouted at them with his robotic arm movements. "Shut it, Four Eyes," Bakugo yelled at him while taking one side of the gym. Yeah, what Katsuki said, in the context rather than the form. "Just remember, if things go south, then throw me under the bus. Besides, this'll be quick," Gar stated with hidden smugness in his voice while taking the other side. "Yeah, quick for you, purple fucker," Bakugo shot back boastfully. Gar's sweat dripped and replied in a monotone, "I'm gonna drill some respect into that thick head of yours, even if I have to use a Behem." Gar then turned to Rotom, motioned to him, and said, "Rotom here will be our referee and HP counter of the Pokemon." Rotom flew in excitedly, exclaiming, "Buzzed. I'll do my utmost best, Garfield." "Buzzed. Trainers, send out your Pokemon." Bakugo was quicker than Gar and threw his Pokeball onto the field first. The golf ball-sized device flew from his fingertips and promptly fell on the ground, not releasing the Pokemon inside. Bakugo stared at the ball in confusion as he exclaimed, "It didn't come out? Oi, purple fucker, are you trying to cheat me? There's no murderous magic animal in here." Gar pinched the bridge of his nose and stated back, "That's because you threw it wrong. You have to push the button in the center, and then you throw it." Bakugo went onto the field to retrieve the ball, pressed the button in the center, and nearly dropped it as it expanded to nearly twice its size. Now the Pokeball was the size of a large apple. Bakugo looked at the ball and then threw it out onto the field. The ball popped open, and out came a bright blue light that manifested into a very unusual-looking creature. To give the short version, it looked like if you took a Diplocaulus, a stealth bomber, and fused the two together, then gave it a creepy ghostly aura that made your skin rise. For the long version, it was very reptilian-looking, and as stated before looks like a giant Diplocaulus. It was much larger than a human. Its body, although short, was colored dark navy blue that fades into a much light cyan blue on its lower body. Its stomach was pale yellow with 3 red triangles pointing up towards its head with red-colored fingers. Its tail is what gave it its length, and was the same color as its lower body, while the very tip seemed to fade out to near transparency. Its head, shaped like a stealth bomber, was triangular, colored dark navy blue that looked black with 4 triangular horns on each side of its head, with the ones closest to its yellow eyes being slightly bigger, red eyelids and pale yellow jaw, the front part of the triangles and tip of its triangular head. Inside of the openings closer to its head were 2 mini baby versions of itself. It also seemed to defy gravity as it sat in the air, floating like it had its own sense of gravity. "Who's that Pokemon?" someone asked. Rotom clicked and beeped while pulling up a pic of the Pokemon and read the data aloud. "Dragapult, the stealth Pokemon. Dex #887. A dragon and ghost type, and the evolved form of Dracloak. When it isn't battling, it keeps Dreepy in the holes on its horns. Once a fight starts, it launches the Dreepy like supersonic missiles. Buzzed. So cool, one person exclaimed. So metal, another shouted. A dragon? So lucky, another groaned in jealousy. It shoots its babies. That's sick, one person commented with a nauseous tone. Rotom heard the last one and added upon it, saying, apparently, the dreepy inside Dragapult's horns eagerly look forward to being launched out at Mach speeds. Bust. Oh, then it's fine, I guess, the same person said in confusion. Meanwhile, Bakugu had a shit-eating grin on his face, seeing that his gut wasn't just right. But he chose one powerful-looking monster. He did not doubt in his mind that he would win so hard that the purple fucker would be crying on the ground in defeat. Gar smiled and said, my turn, go Tojkis. Gar threw the standard ball from his hands, and out popped a new creature that floated around in the air like Dragapult. It was larger than Gar, large enough for him to ride even, shaped like an egg. In fact, it looked like an egg, with two wings that had simple swirls in them, black beady eyes with a kind smile, three horns protruding from its head with the one on the right colored red, and the one on the left colored blue, and the center one was white along with the rest of the body. It had a three-parted tail, each getting smaller, stubby legs with two toes, and its belly had several blue and red triangle markings. Now, who's that Pokemon? The same person asked. Rotom, again, pulled up a pic of the Pokemon and read its entry aloud. Tojkis, the Jubilee Pokemon. Dex #468. A fairy and flying type, and the evolved form of Togetic. It is said that Tojkis never appears where there is conflict, so in recent times it is rarely seen by humans. It's also been known to spread gifts and blessings to those who are away from strife, and as such, has been seen as a symbol of peace, prosperity, and good luck since ancient times. Bust. It's so pretty, a girl cooed. So cute, another girl squealed. Its entry is so sad, one person observed with a sad tone. Seeing everyone's excitement hit its peak, Gar turned to Rotom and said, Rotom, start us off. Rotom switched to battle mode and pulled up two side-by-side pics of Gar and Bakugu with one Pokeball under their faces, with pics of their Pokemon and their health bars, as he stated like an announcer. With pleasure, Bust. Challenger Katsuki Bakugu vs. the reigning champ Garfield. The battle will end once either Pokemon on either side has been defeated. Bust. Ready? Begin. Gar pointed to Bakugu with a flamboyant pose, similar to Aoyama, and offered, Katsuki, since you are the challenger, I'll allow you to attack first. Bakugu smiled wickedly and shouted back, that was your first mistake. All right, dragon, attack. But instead of going after Tojkis, Dragapult just stood there and looked back at Bakugu with a confused expression. Bakugu saw Dragapult's lack of movement and yelled, the hell are you doing? I said attack. Still Dragapult did nothing and sweat dropped at him. Even the Dreepy looked confused and scared, even hiding further in its parents' horns. Do it, you stupid lizard. Kill that flying egg thing, he yelled while stomping the ground with his foot. You have to give him commands, Gar shouted to him across the area. Bakugu growled in anger and shouted back, pissed off. I am giving him commands, but the shitty lizard won't do anything. Gar pulled at his hair with one hand and shouted back, you have to tell him a move. You say Dragapult use, and then the move's name. Bakugu looks at him strangely and asks back, then what the hell does it know? That's what I was trying to never mind. Rotom, if you please. Gar asks Rotom, while facepalming in aggravation and exacerbation. Rotom went off battle mode and flew over to Bakugu, where he pulled up Dragapult's current move list. Bakugu stares at the list with an angry, dumbfounded expression as he states, the fuck is use? Dragon dance. Dragapult then starts to shake its body around like it was dancing. While doing so, a red aura pooled around the Pokemon's body. Bakugu looked at this with an unsatisfied expression and yelled, nothing happened? What gives? Actually, something did happen. Bust. Dragapult's attack and speed stats rose dramatically. Rotom answered. Bakugo looked back at Rotom, where it had its stats with its moves, and saw that its attack and speed did rise. Bakugo smiled and exclaimed, "Keep using Dragon Dance, you fucking lizard." Yet again, Dragapult shook its body, and the same red aura surrounded it, causing its stats to rise even higher. Bakugo smiled even wider at this, and continued commanding the Pokemon to use the same move over and over again. Gar was getting thoroughly impatient at seeing Bakugo, not even attempting to attack like he thought he would. He didn't like it even more that everyone watching had lost their excitement, not having to watch Bakugo tell a dragon to dance ballet. He pushed his hair back and stated impatiently, "Anytime, Katsuki." Bakugo snapped at him and commanded Dragapult, "Keep your shit inside your ass, purple fucker." Dragon dance again. This time when Dragapult danced, no red aura filled its body. Bakugo saw this and shouted, "Hey, nothing happened." That's because Dragapult's attack and speed stats are maxed out. Bust, Rotom explained. "Sometime this century would be nice," Gar vexed him implicitly. Bakugo clicked his tongue and exclaimed, "All right, now use, He looked one last time at the move list before shouting, "Use Flamethrower." Dragapult then opened its mouth and shot out a huge column of flames like a fire-breathing dragon, directly at Togekiss. Gar gave a side smile and commanded Togekiss, "Dodge." Togekiss obeyed, and with quick precision, the egg-shaped Pokemon dodged the attack before it could reach by taking off into the air. Bakugo growled in frustration at this and yelled at Dragapult, "You're supposed to hit that thing, damn it. Go after it and burn it to a crisp with Flamethrower." Dragapult flew closer to Togekiss while trying to blast a flamethrower closer to its body. But Gar reacted quickly and shouted, "Togekiss, keep dodging." Togekiss dodged the fiery breath with ease in one swift movement, almost as if it were nothing but a fun challenge. Bakugo growled angrily and shouted, "Why aren't you roasting it? Come on, stupid lizard. You're supposed to be a fucking dragon. Live up to it." The two Pokemon then took off into their air with Bakugo commanding Dragapult to keep using Flamethrower, while Gar kept telling Togekiss to dodge every attack, which it did with extreme grace. It didn't even look like it was trying to outpace the attack, more like it was doing an aerial dance or just playing, spinning around, making sharp turns, or just looking like it was having a grand time. This game of cat and mouse continued on for some time, as Dragapult still failed to hit Togekiss even once, and Gar was getting rather impatient from this circus show. So he cupped his hands and stated loudly, "You know, Dragapult has other moves. You should try them instead of being a one-move Ponyta." Bakugo only glared at Gar, but then got an idea as he commanded Dragapult, "Get above that thing and use Flamethrower." Dragapult obeyed and flew right above Togekiss, who did not notice his disappearance at first. Dragapult opened his mouth as hot embers pooled out. The smell and sound of Dragapult's incoming attack alerted Togekiss, and the Pokemon looked up just in time to see the dragon. Gar then quickly shouted to Togekiss, "Togekiss, use Air Slash to get away." Togekiss turned around, belly up, and flapped its wings quickly. Cutting streams of air were produced from its wings, just as Dragapult breathed fire. The two attacks collide and cancel each other out. However, Togekiss's attack sends the bird egg flying towards the ground and out of reach from the explosion. Togekiss flaps its wings and hovers just inches off the ground after just nosediving at top speed. Bakugo smiles a toothy grin and shouts, "Use Shadow Sneak." Dragapult then dives down to the ground at Mach speed and disappears into the shadows like a ghost. Togekiss sees this and becomes visibly anxious as it looks around to spot Dragapult. Gar sees Togekiss's distress and calms it down, saying, "It's okay, Togekiss. Just keep vigilant. Dragapult could pop out of anywhere, then be ready to counter." Togekiss chirps and watches the whole field around it like a hawk, though it doesn't do much for the Pokemon, as Dragapult sulks through the darkness like a shark and then pops out and ramps into Tojkis with a sneak attack of ghostly power. Tojkis cries out and is sent flying across the field. Tojkis, Gar yells in distressed worry. Bakugo sees Tojkis cry out in pain and smiles at finally nailing the creature. He takes the opportunity to attack while Gar is distracted and shouts, "Now use dragon darts." Dragapult sucks in air through its mouth, and suddenly the two Dreepy are launched from its horns like twin missiles. Gar sees this, just as Tojkis gets up, and says, "Tojkis." Tojkis looks at its master waiting for the command, sees Gar's reassuring smile and says, "Stand firm and let the attack hit." Tojkis chirps in reply and levitates into the air, while standing perfectly still. The twin Dreepy closes the distance in seconds, and both hit directly into Tojkis, causing a small cloud of dust to form. Bakugo smiles proudly, and in an ego-feeding tone, he shouts, "Ha! Finally got that stupid egg thing. Ready to throw in the towel, purple fucker." Gar gave a small smile as a shadow covered his eyes. That made Bakugo backtrack a bit, and made him lose all his self-assuredness and smugness. Gar then looked up. With his now visible face, he said, "Oh please, I haven't even begun to fight. I let you have your fun. But now it's my turn." Gar turned his attention back to the small dust cloud starting to settle, making Bakugo look in that direction, and his face immediately dropped upon seeing what he did. Tojkis was simply floating in the same spot, without even a scratch on its white body. Bakugo looked at Rotom, who was still keeping HP count, and saw that Tojkis had not taken any damage from the previous attack. "Nothing happened?" Bakugo mouthed quietly. Gar then pointed his arm at Dragapult and commanded, "Tojkis, get in close and use Thunder Wave." Tojkis chirped in reply and flew towards Dragapult with blinding speed. Dragapult freaked out as Tojkis approached and tried to slap the bird away with its tail. Tojkis dodged it with a spin, getting it closer, and then emitting a wave of electricity at the dragon Pokémon. Dragapult cried out in distress and fell to the ground as electricity surged through its body. Bakugo stared entranced in shock for a moment as the dragon crumpled to the ground without taking any damage. He shook himself out of his mist and shouted, "What the crap? Oi dragon, get up. You're supposed to be invincible, so get off the ground." Dragapult tried to raise itself up on its stubby limbs, but only fell on the ground as electricity arched around it. Buzzed. Dragapult has been paralyzed and is unable to move. Bust. Rotom announced as a yellow symbol went over Dragapult's HP bar. "Paralyzed? What does that mean?" Uraraka asked. "I think it means what Rotom said. Dragapult's movement is limited," Todoroki answered. Seeing his chance, Gar smiled and commanded his Pokémon, "Send Dragapult into the air with Air Slash." Tojkis flew under Dragapult's body and flapped its wings hard, creating the same blade-cutting air currents as before. Only this time, they sent Dragapult soaring into the air. Tojkis wasn't too far behind as it closed the distance between the airborne dragon and appeared right above it. "Now, Tojkis, finish it off with dazzling gleam," Gar shouted with excitement. Tojkis pushed its chest out as its red and blue triangle markings began to glow a bright pink. The sparkling became so intense that the sparkles shot from its marks and pelted the dragon in literal sparkles. Dragapult cried out from the bombardment and fell from the sky, due to the attack pushing him down, and fell to the earth with swirls in its eyes. The HP counter on Rotom immediately dropped down to 0. Dragapult is unable to battle. "The champion Garfield is the victor," Rotom announced. "He won," one person said in a neutral tone. "He won," several others cheered. "Bakugo lost," another said in a neutral observation. "Lost badly, lol." Another made fun of the ash blonde. Gar ran up to Tojkis and hugged the giant egg bird. He shouted gleefully, "All right, Tojkis." Tojkis chirped with joyfulness and nuzzled into the older teen, absorbing the cuddles and affection. Gar then pulled away from Tojkis and took out its Pokeball. He said, Good job. Now heal up with Roost and return. Tojkus chirped in compliance, landed on the ground, and a ring of feathers spun around it, cleaning up its wounds. Once Tojkus was healed, a beam of light shot out from the pokeball, and Tojkus's matter was converted and stored into energy. Meanwhile, at the other end of the field, Bakugo was on his hands and knees looking at the ground with an expression crossed between shock, panic, disbelief, and fear. He looked only moments from having a breakdown as he stuttered to himself in a low tone. I what? BB but I? He dribbled on as Gar walked up to him. And I'll be taking that back. Thank you very much. Gar said to Bakugo, while taking the Ultra Ball from his hands and pointing it at the fainted Pokemon. He said, "All right, Dragapult, return." Dragapult then returned to the ball and disappeared. Just as Gar shrunk the Pokeball, Bakugo was coming out of his funk and asked, How? It's a dragon. It's supposed to be invincible, right? Gar looked at him strangely and answered, Dragon types, invincible. PSH, don't make me laugh. Not even Arceus is invincible, and I caught it. I think. He said the last part softly. No, what you failed to realize are type advantages, he explained. Bakugo looked at him like a lost child and asked, Type, what? Basically, every Pokemon has a specific type, and each type is strong or weak to something. A little tidbit of info I was trying to explain to you before. Until you said you were totally fine with the Pokemon you chose and said, and I quote, I don't care, let's fight bitch. You also said you'd beat any of my Pokemon with your one end quote. He explained. Then how did Tojkus win? Aren't dragons supposed to be super strong? Izuku asked, while walking up to the two teens. They are. But with every great strength comes an equal great weakness. For instance, dragon types are normally weak to other dragons, ice, and fairy. A type that Tojkus just so happens to be, Gar explained with a smug smile. Hearing this made Bakugo lose his current meek attitude and regain his constantly angry one, as he started off in a low tone. You cheated. You played me, you bastard. He shouted the last part while jumping up and pointing a convincing finger. Gar pushed his finger away with an annoyed expression and shot back. I didn't cheat. You just rushed into this battle like some beginner noob trainer fighting a Geodude with a Charmander. I tried to tell you about all my Pokemon, what they are, their types, even their moves. I would have even told you about type matchups and let you choose a Pokemon from me. So when you didn't, naturally, I did the smart thing and used the type advantage. Bakugo's face immediately dropped after hearing this. He knew he was smart, but he really messed up with this. He thought it would be easy, just two animals fighting, and the one hitting harder would win. But he forgot that to hit hard, you have to think hard. I was smart, and you were dumb. Battles are just like fighting. You take the best course of action in order to prevail, even by a slim margin. He finished up while walking away. Bakugo clicked his tongue and mumbled under his breath. You just got lucky, purple fucker. Gar snapped his head so fast back to Bakugo that an audible crack could be heard from his neck, as he glared daggers at the ash blonde and stormed in front of him, exclaiming in a yell, Lucky? Lucky? It was not luck that let me beat you. Bakugo was taken aback by this. He never saw someone willing get into his face and yell back. Normally, anyone would flee or stay passively silent. Gar continued with his rant, exclaiming, I've traveled around every continent and faced off against every gym leader, collected every badge, challenged every Elite Four member, and faced off against every champion of every region and won. And I've become champion of every region, caught all Pokemon, including legendaries and mythical, and completed every Pokédex. I've Roman 4 trained, and shiny bred tons of Pokemon. I've mastered every kind of Pokemon food paraphernalia, and even completed the 151 recipes in the Currydex. I even still take top spots in all Pokemon coordinator events across several regions. At the mere age of 10, I dismantled an evil team, faced off against the Elite Four, and defeated the champion on my first try. I don't have luck. I have skill. He exclaimed the last part while inching closer to Bakudu's face. Just before any of them could proceed with another action, a very similar and dead-sounding voice asked, "What is going on here?" "Ah, Aizawa-sensei," one person shouted in surprise. "Care to explain what you're all doing here instead of in class, where you should be?" Aizawa asked rhetorically. We were just, One person tried to speak, but only came out with a gargle. Kaminari, who was already sweating bullets and panicking, blubbered out. Garfield's Bahia manners drilled into a Malamur mind raped. Silence filled the whole gym as everyone just stared at the electric teen with weird expressions or sweat dropped at his explanation. Even Mimikyu, who was sitting on Gar's shoulder, his little painted face looked confused and done. "Really?" Aizawa asked blandly. Gar then took a breath and walked up to Aizawa. He explained, "It's my fault, Eraserhead. I convinced everyone to skip class to watch a Pokemon battle between Katsukui and me. He was still sore from yesterday, so I instigated this battle. We just finished, so if you want to punish anyone, punish me." Gar then gave the teacher his biggest, saddest, most soulful yamper eyes he ever made. Aizawa sighed at this and said back, "Since you are new, and with the added point of your predicament, I'll let it slide, but only this once." Gar smiled at his response, which almost faded at Aizawa's follow-up. "However, you all will be subjected to the same exact kind of punishment for leaving class. Understood?" "Yes, sir," the whole class said in unison. Aizawa then rubbed the back of his head in exasperation, and looking around, he stated, "Now, since we're already in Gym Beta, go and change into your gym uniforms and be back out here to do 50 laps. And we'll keep doing laps until you all truly learn your lesson about skipping and responsibility." "Yes, sir," the class replied in unison. "Also, what is that?" Aizawa motioned to Rotom, floating next to Gar's head. "Oh, that's Rotom," Gar answered. "Hello? Bust." Rotom greeted the tired man. Aizawa was silent for a few moments as he looked over the floating machine, whether to make sure what he was seeing was real or trying to figure something out with it. The latter was confirmed, as Aizawa asked, "Can he keep count of things?" "Ooh, I think so," Gar replied while shrugging, and Rotom nodded. "Or whatever you call it." "Good. Then he'll be the one to keep track of every lap you all take." Aizawa immediately followed up with an unsettling smile. Rotom made a bunch of displeased electronic noises and replied loudly, "Arceus, damn it. Buzzed." After everyone had gone through hell and high water, having to do 50 more laps on top of their previous ones, Aizawa then kept them in Gym Beta to do even more exercises until lunchtime rolled around. All the students, especially the more athletic ones, were extremely exhausted and aching all over from the nearly nonstop working and moving around. Even Gar commented that he hadn't had a workout like that since he scaled MT Silver at age 11. Gar even took Mimikyu with him to lunch, with the small creature being held in his arms. Although he wasn't supposed to have his Pokemon in the open, especially around other school students, Mimikyu did have the advantage of looking like just a toy so long as he was held and acted accordingly. Once they all got their food and finally sat at their tables, they all nearly melted right into them from sheer exhaustion. Some fell right to sleep. Some fell face first into their food or the table, and some went completely stiff in their seats, while others were just too hungry to even care about being tired. One of them being Gar, who was now ravenously chowing down into his meat curry, meat pie, meat soup, and meat sandwich like a starving animal. He made the more horrible sounds when inhaling his food, and had a whole list of other lousy table manners. Everyone sitting around him looked on in disgust as he mindlessly continued to eat. Having had enough of it, Ida spoke up and stated, "Gar-kun, can you please? Your table manners are absolutely horrendous. It's making us lose ours." "Wah," Gar looked up to Ida with a full mouth and glazed expression. This only made Ida nearly vomit at him, which Gar noticed and swallowed the food remaining in his mouth. He wiped his face with his sleeve and asked, "Sorry, what did you say, Tenya?" "Your table manners. My goodness, Gar-kun. Did your mother teach you nothing?" Ida asked in a nauseous tone. Gar's face went from exhaustion to anger in 0.1 seconds as he threateningly pointed his fork at Ida and stated firmly, "Don't ever bring my mother into anything. I'm sorry, okay? But that's no excuse for your table etiquette." Ida put his hands up defensively. "He's right, Ida-kun. You didn't have to bring his mom into this," Uraraka stated plainly, while mindlessly failing to pick up her food. "My point still stands," Ida defended himself. "Well, you could have just said that," Gar said while pulling his fork away and taking back his calmer expression. "And besides, I've been on my own for a long time now. No time to think about table manners when you travel by yourself, sleep in the wilds, and train Pokemon," he explained while taking another bite of his food. "I guess I can understand that. But while you're here in this prestigious school, you will be retaught proper table manners," Ida stated firmly. "Yes, Mom," Gar sassed him. "Sorry, Mom, we'll do better," Uraraka added mindlessly. "Well, make your proud, Mom," Izuku also added, half awake. "Please stop calling me Mom," Ida said in a small and embarrassed voice. "Yes, Mom," they all replied in unison. This only caused Ida to blush and hide his face. A little while later, Mina eventually joined the table sitting next to Gar, who hadn't noticed her yet. She waited for a moment to see if he would acknowledge her or any of them, but Gar only continued to numbly much away. "Hey Gar-san," Mina called for his attention. Gar came back to reality and turned to her with a half-full mouth. He said, "Huh?" Seeing his derpy expression and puffy cheeks made Mina giggle a bit. So she quickly took a moment to take a pic of him. After pocketing her phone, she asked, "So back at Gym Beat, when you and Bakugo battled, you said something about typings. What is that exactly?" The light returned to Gar's eyes. Hearing this and shaking himself awake, he swallowed his food and explained to her. "Well, typings are a system of simplifying which Pokemon belongs in which group. Like your world's animal system, kingdom, phylum, genus, and species. Stuff like that. We have a more advanced system for Pokemon in egg groups, body shapes, height and weight, and so on. But typing is just a straightforward version. A Pokemon is usually given a typing group when taking into account lots of factors." At this point, Mina looked totally lost. Gar saw this and sighed while saying, "Maybe I should just simplify it. If a Pokemon lives in the water and has features related to living in water, then it's a water type. If it lives in the cold, then it's an ice type. Fiery parts or a hot environment. Fire type. Spews toxic material and makes others sick. Poison. Though finding certain types for some Pokemon is harder for others. They either have to observe them in the wild or battle them with certain moves to see what works the most and least effective. Then make a determination from there." Mina mulled over this for a bit of coyly asking, "Suo, since we are basically your world's equivalent of Pokemon, what would my type be?" "Your type?" Gar questioned. "Well, from what you told me about your quirk, I'd say you would be a poison type." This made Mina squeal with delight. "What about me? What type would I be?" Kaminari asked excitedly while sitting down with them. "That's easy, pure electric," Gar pointed. Kaminari then did a fist pump into the air and cheered. "How about me?" Kirishima asked while coming to the table. "Rock or rock fighting?" Gar answered. Kirishima smiled with bright teeth. "What about?" Another person began to ask until Gar cut them off. "Okay, you know what? How about I just go down the list and name it off in rapid fire, okay?" Gar asked as everyone else was starting to move over upon hearing the conversation. Nodded with him. Uraraka and Izuku snapped out of their tired trance to pay attention. Even the aloof Todoroki and distant Takoyami joined out of curiosity. Gar sighed and rubbed his chin. He looked around at where he should start. Who was the easiest to identify, and then move from there? He already did it with Mina, Kirishima, and Kaminare, so who's next? He just thought to do everyone at the table he's sitting at and go from there. So he turned and looked around and pointed at people. He said, "Pure water. Fairy psychic combo. Normal or normal fighting. Pure fighting. Pure fighting or fighting normal. Electric fighting combo. Fairy or normal fairy. Pure normal. Pure normal again, though you could squeak by with steel. Pure normal or pure ghost or ghost fairy combo. Dark flying. Fire ice combo." He pointed to Tsuyu, Uraraka, Sato, Shoji, Ajiro, Izuku, Aoyama, Koda, Jiro, Toru, Takoyami, and Todoroki in that order. Gar then stopped when he came to Ida and thought for a moment. After some silence, he finally said, "I'm not sure what to put you as, Tenya. I would say normal. But you got metallic parts, so that you may be steel. And you also move really fast, so maybe flying." "How do I count as a bird?" Ida asked, confused. "Oh, trust me, the flying type is very lenient. There are these two Pokemon called Doduo and Dodrio, who are wingless bird Pokemon who are flying types and can learn the move fly. I'm not sure how though, and I've never seen one use fly in a battle before. Suwoo, yeah, one or the other." Gar explained. Ida obviously didn't like his answer, but accepted nonetheless. Gar then turned his attention to both Zero and Minta and scratched his head. "I don't know. Normal or bug type, I guess," he shrugged. "Bug," they both shouted. "Why bug? Is it because I'm short?" "It's because I'm short, isn't it?" Minta cried in anger. Gar put his hands up in defense and stated quickly, "Well, there's nothing that says elemental about you two. And the closest thing that your quirks come close to in the natural world are bug types." Zero and Minta sank to the floor and muttered to themselves, while softly sobbing about being compared to an insect. Gar's sweat dropped at this and turned to the final person, being Momo. He looked at her, and after about a minute of uncomfortable staring, he finally said, "I have no idea." "What?" some of them asked aloud. "Just like that?" one person asked. "That's it," another added. "Yep," Gar replied simply. "So does she not fall into any category?" Izuku asked. Gar shook his head and replied, "No, she falls into every category." "What? How?" Momo asks, surprised. That made everyone laugh out loud until someone else asked, "Let me guess. Aizawa-sensei would be pure dark, right?" Gar shook his head, which made everyone stop, until he replied, "Don't be silly. He'd be a fairy type." This got another round of laughter from the class, as they all joked around with each other on their typings or combos, which carried on till the end of lunch. In the hall. After lunch ended, the teens walked down the hall in a huge group, talking amongst one another as they made their way back to their home class for their next heroics lesson. They still weren't at the classroom when Ida, who saw Gar's visible pokeballs hanging around his belt, asked, "Gar-kun, why do you have your pokeballs out in the open? Aren't you afraid that if someone knew about them, they'd steal them and then use your Pokemon against you?" Gar shook his head and replied, "Even if someone did manage to snag one of my balls, they wouldn't open." Ida looked at him confused and followed up with, "But we just saw Bakugo-san use them, but a few hours ago." "That's because I allowed him to use them." He explained like it was simple. I think I can speak for all of us when I say we need more context to that statement. Momo stated, with everyone agreeing. Gar's sweat dropped and explained, "Sorry guys, I guess I forget you don't know how things work in my world. You see, we have these things called trainer IDs. Every trainer or someone with a Pokemon has one. It's basically something that's wired into the Pokeballs we own in order to use them. It's like a touch-activated thing. I don't know all the details. So if someone without a trainer ID or a different ID wouldn't be able to use someone else's Pokeballs, they just stay in rest mode. So when Katsuki used them, I simply deactivated the lock feature for anyone to use." Everyone seemed to understand and nodded to show it. "And even if they did manage to hack or overwrite my ID, my Pokemon would never attack me. I've built unbreakable bonds with all my Pokemon, so I'd have nothing to worry about. Even if they did want to obtain my Pokemon and control them, they'd either have to mind control them, have me trade them, or steal them with a thief ball." He explained further. "What's a thief ball?" someone pipes up. Gar put his arms behind his head in a resting position and explained. "A specialized Pokeball that is, as the name implies, designed to steal other people's caught Pokemon, rewriting the person ID with their own." Hearing this new bit of info made everyone gasp. They didn't think it was possible, but if you could lock it up, someone could eventually break it open. But they're highly illegal, so anyone caught buying or manufacturing any would be granted the worst punishment possible. So many criminals or regular idiots are just too scared to attempt to make them. Gar followed up, seeing everyone's shocked expressions, which did calm them down some. Just as everyone was coming off that shock, Toru piped up and chirped out, "So, off-topic question. What other Pokemon do you have? You said you could only have about 6, and we've seen 4, so who are the other 2? Gar looks to where he assumed where the invisible girl's face was and replied, "Sorry, Toru, but that's a surprise," while bopping the tip of her nose, though only getting her head. I hate suspense," Toru complained while waving her arms up and down. "Speaking of Pokemon, what do you eat in your world?" Zero asked out of the blue. Gar looked at him with the most off-put expression as he asked back, "Excuse you? You really like meat, right?" he followed up. Gar nodded and replied, "Amongst other things, yeah. It's my favorite thing in the world. My mom was always strapped for cash, so we had meat on very rare occasions. So when I sought out on my own and gained enough coin, I would eat meat all the time." "Why are you asking?" "So then, you eat Pokemon?" Zero asked carefully. Gar stifled a laugh and stated, "Well, duh. Where do you think meat comes from? A tree, a farm, the supermarket." Everyone just stared at the older teen with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Until Kaminari put it best, saying, "That's kinda wrong, dude. I mean, you train, battle, and love these things like pets. And on top of that you eat them. Don't you technically do the same with your world's animals?" he asked back. To which everyone gained understanding expressions on their faces mixed with disbelief. Certain Pokemon have certain purposes. Some are used in battle, some are more accustomed to domestic life, and some are better for eating. That's just how things are. And besides that, there are like 1,000 different Pokemon. Don't you think at some point someone would try a few of those meats? Everyone still looked incredulously at these facts, but nodded their heads nonetheless. Even Pokemon eat each other. For instance, Corsola is the favorite food of Toxapex, Walrein is the natural prey of Sharpedo, and Swellow loves to gobble up Wurmple. That's called nature. Gar gave some examples for the class to understand, which they did, albeit in small increments. My favorite is Slowpoke Tail. You'll never taste anything better, Gar recalled with happy sparkles in his eyes. What about the rest of it? Someone asked. Gar shook his head and answered, Nope, just the tail. The rest of the Pokemon is just disgusting. Ugh, it's like a garbage disposal. It'll eat anything, and its body doesn't process it properly. So you kill a whole animal for a single part? One person asked with a horrified expression. Gar waved off the accusation and explained, Don't be ridiculous. That would be wasteful. You just cut off the tail. That's totally inhumane, someone shouted in horror. Again Gar waved off the accusation and explained, No, it's totally fine. Slowpoke naturally lose their tails all the time. Sometimes they just fall off for no reason. They grow back after a couple of days or so. And the Slowpoke almost never realize that they're in pain. I actually keep a few Slowpoke around just for the purpose of eating. Hearing this, everyone's faces of horror returned to normal as they understood more of Gar's world and the rules governing the use of Pokemon. Just like theirs, so if there were a problem, it would be taken care of properly, while having science and rules dictated it. Gar then licked his lips as he added in, My favorite dish is sweet and bitter smoked Slowpoke tail curry. My mouth is watering just thinking about it. Drool dribbling down his lips. Izuku laughed at his funny face and mannerism, then added, It must be that good since we just finished lunch. As they talked some more and walked, they were just at the entrance of One's door, when suddenly someone asked something that halted them all in place. So then you could technically eat Mimikyu? A voice asked Gar. Everyone stopped in their tracks and slowly looked down at the curious face of Mainta, who seemed dead serious about his question. Normally someone would berate him for such a question, but the context and the seriousness in his eyes prevented any of them from speaking. Even the quick and well-spoken Gar was dumbfounded, opening and closing his mouth like a fish, unable to process any form of words or advanced sound. Well, I guess, Gar finally got out as he glanced over to Mimikyu, who was trying to hide in Izuku's hair. But I don't think anything would even dare such a feat because of, well, He followed up, though this made Mimikyu only sad instead of scared. Izuku saved the teen's butt by saying quickly, Also, he's too cute to eat, while holding Mimikyu in a cuddling hug, which the small Pokemon returned. Gar gave Izuku a thank you smile as Izuku gave him a thumbs up. Gar then turned back to Mainta and explained further. And besides that, I don't think you can eat a ghost-type Pokemon unless you're a ghost type yourself. Just then, a very familiar and monotoned voice called the teen attention, saying, Hey! The teen turned their heads to the voice and saw their teacher standing near the doorway, blocked by the crowd of teens. No one said anything or moved until Aizawa finally got fed up and firmly stated, Enough chit-chat and get back to class, or unless you all want to do more exercises until the end of school. Yes, sir. They all obeyed out of fear, in unison, while rushing back into the classroom and taking their seats to finish off the day. Yep, Aizawa would definitely be a fairy type. The following day, everyone was nearly late to class due to reporters and paparazzi flooding the school gates. It was like trying to get away from a swarm of loud flashing bees while being in a tight space. Apparently, They were all here after the news of All Might working in UA caught wind, then, of course, spread like wildfire. It was so bad that teachers had been called to control the hungry crowd, and many students were so grossly underprepared that Gar even offered Nezu to use Gyarados to scare them off and call it a freak illusion quirk, especially after seeing Izuku freeze up in the group of reporters like a deerling in the headlights. He'd remembered back to a time when he was much like Izuku. He wasn't good with crowds, pushing, tight spaces, or confrontation. He'd really have to teach that kid some backbone. Luckily, Ida and Uraraka were there to save him. But things were still bad. However, the principal declined, saying there would only be pandemonium for so many people freaking out at once. Also saying that the staff is well trained to deal with things like this. He didn't like the answer, but accepted nonetheless. After everyone made it to class, they all showed heavy signs of being completely spent from yesterday's hell's ride of exercise. Completely sore on just about every region of their bodies. Some of them could barely pay attention to the lesson they were being taught. Some looked half asleep. Some looked like they were sleeping with their eyes open. And many others looked like zombies. And it didn't help that the day dragged on. It was nearly lunch when Aizawa returned to the room. After doing something outside the class and walking to the podium, he looked to his class. All of the students mentally prayed that Aizawa would go easy on them. After all, they could barely pay attention to his previous lesson. However, he surprised them all when he stated, "Today, you'll be picking a class president representative." Everyone looked like the surprised Pikachu meme at his words, and were in complete silence for several seconds until they all exploded and began to cheer with full excitement, and for doing something normal for once. Some people even announced what changes or rules they would put into effect if they were elected. Then there was Mainta, who, while drooling like a stoutland, was yelling about how he would have the girls wear very short skirts to school. However, he went quiet when he noticed Mimikyu standing on his desk, next to him with his beady eyes sparkling like a mad person, stroking his cheek with killer intent. Aizawa quickly silenced them by activating his quirk intimidatingly and saying, "You all decide on who should be your representative by lunch. I'm going to the teacher's lounge to nap. Don't destroy one another in your decision-making." And with that, the extremely tired man walked out of the room with his sleeping bag over his shoulder. Immediately after he left, Ida took the front of the classroom and told everyone that they should hold out a vote to see who among them would be most suited and well trusted for the job. Mina said that would be stupid since everyone would just vote for themselves. Everyone didn't deny this. However, they decided to go along with the vote anyway with no other option available to them. Everyone was then handed a small slip of paper, wrote their candidate, and placed it into a literal hat. Gar even took one for Mimikyu to write his answer, though this confused Kirishima, handing out the papers. Thinking he made a mistake, he tried to take the slip from Mimikyu's little hand, but the Pokemon held onto it tightly and tried to pull it back. Kirishima just kept pulling back harder, having a game of tug-of-war until Mimikyu finally had enough and hissed at Kirishima, who whipped his hand away. Dude?" Gar looked up to Kirishima. "Why did you give one to Mimikyu?" "Well, of course, his vote counts, you silly," he answered. "As cute as that is, Mimikyu is pretty much an animal. We're counting people voting for another person." He came back. Gar tapped his chin with his own and replied, "Well, Mimikyu and the rest of my Pokemon are going to be a part of this class. So it only seems fair that I give them a choice since someone will be regulating how I use them. Not that I'd listen." Kirishima looked like his brain was buffering for a minute before replying, "I guess that makes sense. So what about the other 5? Only Mimikyu is interested in stuff like this, and I don't think the rest would be. But I'll ask anyway," Gar said, while taking off 2 Pokeballs from his belt and tossing them into the air. They both popped open, and both Togekiss and Dragapult appeared in the class, drawing everyone's attention. "You two want to vote for class president?" Gar asked the two Pokemon as Kirishima smiled awkwardly and held out two sheets. Dragapult looked completely disinterested as he rolled his eyes and meandered around the class. Though, the Dreepy did snag the sheets and began to play with them, while Touchkis took no mind to it and tried to sit its giant body in Gar's lap, practically smothering him as it cuddled up to his face. "I guess that's two-nosed. All right, return," Gar gasped out while returning his Pokemon. Gar looked to Kirishima, who was eyeing the last 3 balls on his belt, and the older teen stated, "Ha, no. I'm not bringing out Gyarados or the other two." "Why not?" he complained. "Do you really want me to send out my 26 FTC Serpent into this tiny classroom?" Gar asked rhetorically as Kirishima gulped dryly. "Didn't think so. Also, if the first two didn't care, then neither would the other two. I know them well enough." Kirishima gave a disappointed sigh, pouted, and walked off. Before he did, he quickly turned around and asked, "What about Rotom?" Just then, the little phone Pokemon popped out from behind Gar and answered, "I try not to get involved in politics," buzzed, and disappeared behind Gar. Kirishima shrugged and walked off. Gar wrote down his vote and folded the paper. He turned to Mimikyu, who was hard at work on his penmanship, and asked, "So who'd you vote for?" Mimikyu then immediately covered its paper with its arms and looked stressed at Gar. This reaction made him giggle and pet its disguised head. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked that. We're not supposed to be influenced by each other. It's supposed to be a secret." Gar condolences while putting his index finger to his mouth. Mimikyu also mimicked Gar's gesture, which made him smile warmly at the Pokemon. After everyone wrote down their vote and placed it in the hat, Ida then went to the whiteboard and wrote down everyone's name on it. Then put a tally mark next to everyone's name that he pulled from the hat. In the end, he found one last piece of paper, but got a confused look when he read it. "And one scribble?" he questioned aloud. Gar saw that it was Mimikyu's vote and spoke up, saying, "Oh, that means GI." He trailed off at seeing Mimikyu's anxious expression. He quickly changed it up, saying, "I mean, that's quite the predicament. Let me see if I can translate it for you." Gar looked over to Mimikyu and saw a look of relief and satisfaction on its tiny face. Gar then walked up to the front and looked at Mimikyu's not-so-secret vote. Lo and behold, he was right. It was just a bunch of scribbles. Normally, Pokemon can't write a complex language unless they have hands, that level of intelligence, or are a psychic type, and Mimikyu did fall into any of those categories. However, Mimikyu did possess some degree of intelligence and would use art to convey what he was thinking, so Gar could easily decipher who he was voting for by seeing what he drew. A skill he picked up after traveling with Mimikyu since he caught him in the abandoned mart. From what he could see, it was definitely a person since it had a head with eyes, a smile, and hair. The hair was big, wild, and fluffy, the eyes were large, the smile was large and kind-looking, and the face had little dots all over them. What were those supposed to be, blemishes? Oh, they were freckles. Now Gar could see who Mimikyu voted for. He took the chalk from Ida, placed a tally next to Izuku's name, and then took his seat. After all was said and done, nearly everyone had at least one tally by their names, except for Ida, Momo, and Izuku. Momo had 2, Ida had 3, and Izuku had 5. This, of course, surprised Izuku as he sat stiffly in his seat with a surprised expression. The crowd cheered, and Ida went over to shake Izuku's limp hand in congratulation and accept his position as vice president while going on and on with some boring speech. While Gar giggled at Izuku's reaction and Mimikyu cheered with the class. Lunch. Later in the lunchroom, Izuku, Ida, Uraraka, Gar, and Mimikyu were all sitting at the same table with Izuku, unable to touch his food as he still kept the same stiff posture and frozen expression from when they were in class previously. At this point of seeing Izuku act like a quagsire in a motionless stream, His worry turned to be fed up and promptly slapped the back of his head, only coming to this option when neither Uraraka nor Ida couldn't snap him out. Izuku snapped out of his trance and nearly face planted into his food from the slap. He looked at Gar with a painful yet betrayed confused expression. Gar sighed and said, "Sorry, dude, but you weren't responding to anything. We exhaust all other options. I know it's surprising to be given such a position, but really, you're just being a drama jinx. Feel your backbone, accept it, and take it in stride." Izuku rubbed his head and meekly replied, "Sorry, it's shocking, you know? I didn't think I would get the position at all or even a vote. It's just so surreal, like a dream. I mean, why would anyone want to vote for me? Don't think of it that way, Midori-kun. You were chosen with the most votes for a reason. You are obviously the most trusted candidate." Ida reassured him. Uraraka nodded. Gar took another bite of his meat meal and added in, "Come on, Izuku, don't sell yourself short. You can't tell me you're not used to positive feedback." Izuku went silent as he looked down at his food. Gar had always been good at reading people, mostly due to being a trainer. And being a trainer meant you have to read your Pokemon at a moment's notice to change up the battle. So when he saw Izuku's reaction, he stopped eating and gained a look of disbelief which Mimikyu followed. "Holy fucking Arceus, you are serious," he said in a serious yet low tone. "Gar-kun is right, Deku-kun. You shouldn't sell yourself short. After all, I voted for you." Uraraka broke in with her bubbly voice. "What?" Izuku exclaimed in surprise. "As did I," Ada chimed in. "You too?" he followed up. "Guilty," Gar said with his mouth half full, hand raised. "Wah-huh?" Izuku stammered out, looking around the table. "I may try to stay away from politics, but I would have voted for you. Bust." Rotom popped out. Izuku whipped his head around the table with a complete flabbergasted look as he asked in a shaky tone, You guys mean it?" Everyone nodded their heads. Izuku was so happy yet at the same time trying to hold back his tears. So he had a constipated look on his face as he quivered with happiness. After sniffing down his emotions, he realized something. And asking his friends, he said, "But if that's true, then who were the other two that voted for me?" Gar immediately saw Mimikyu tense up at the question and saw Ida look towards Mimikyu's direction, knowing what he would answer. So Gar quickly cut him off and stated, "Good question. Guess we'll never find out." This made Izuku smile, and Mimikyu silently sighs with relief. As Gar took another bite of his food, without looking up at the others, he blabbered out, "You know, it's actually kind of funny. My original vote was going to be for Mimikyu." Mimikyu immediately stopped trying to snag Gar's food and looked up to him with a mix of surprise and happiness. "Yeah, mine too," Uraraka added. "I considered it myself," Izuku stated. At this point, Mimikyu was acting much like Izuku previously did, whipping his head between voices in disbelief and unable to process what he was hearing. "Bust. Mimikyu for Class 1 of President People," Rotom stated, while Gar held him up on the palm of his hand. Mimikyu was now just as much of a mess as Izuku was before, having a mix of happiness and shock with some embarrassment for flavor. He hid his blushing face into his little arms and shook back and forth with excited joyfulness. However, this cute moment was cut inexplicably short by the sound of blaring alarms. Everyone stopped in the lunchroom, silencing all conversation and ending all meals as the sirens blared off their ear-beating sound in everyone's heads. "What's that?" Gar asked over the noise. "The warning sirens. Level 3 threat," Ida answered in a shout. "And that means?" Gar asked back. "Someone has broken through security and entered the school grounds," Ida half shouted. Soon the entire cafeteria was emptying out with a huge wave of confused and scared students leaving in a hurry. Gar picked up Mimikyu while Izuku, Ida, and Uraraka decided to stay back for a while, as things were starting to get a little crazy in the crowd with people starting to get into a panic. Unfortunately, All the teens were forcefully swept into the mob by other students, practically pushing them with their numbers. That's when things got really hectic, such as shoving, hitting, and even trampling over smaller students. Gar was bumped around quite a bit and knocked with elbows or kicked by feet so many times he began to bruise and become anxious. He hadn't felt this claustrophobic since his first time in Diglett's cave. Being swarmed by Zubat every 5 feet, Mimikyu took quick notice of Gar's increasingly high emotional distress and state of health, which ticked the Pokémon off to no end. Mimikyu's eyes lit up like two sparkles as black matter began to swirl around its actual mouth. Gar noticed this and hugged the creature close to his body, and he chanted in a mantra, "Please don't use Dark Pulse. Please 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 don't use Dark Pulse." Suddenly, a loud noise that drowned out the alarm and other students' panic came over everyone's ear, causing them to stop. Then a large figure flew overhead and landed right on the exit sign, while hanging from it like an apum. That figure was Ida, who announced to the panicking crowd that it was just the reporters and media that broke through UA security. He told everyone to calm down, separate into their classes, take a head count, and calmly leave for their classes by 3rd year first. And surprisingly, everyone did just that. Ida, Izuku, Uraraka, and Gar meet back up at their table with the rest of their class after everything starts to settle down and people go to group up with their classes. Gar rubbed the pain out of the bruise on the back of his head as he said, "Nice timing, Tenya. No, really. Another minute, and I'm sure Mimikyu would have been blasting several dozen people with Dark Pulse." Well, action had to be taken, and with everyone panicking, I had to work quickly, Ida stated as he moved his arms robotically. "Are you okay, Gar? You look pretty beat up. You should probably see Recovery Girl," Izuku asked with concern. Gar waved it off and replied, "I'm fine, trust me, I've been through far worse." Izuku didn't like this answer and stared up at him like a disappointed parent. Gar's sweat dropped at Izuku's attempt to look authoritatively displeased and added, "But I will go see her just to be sure." After all the classes had been separated and sent off to the respective classrooms, Gar left for Recovery Girl. After coming back with a clean bill of health, he saw Ida and Izuku discussing something, and from the looks on their faces, it was serious. At that time, Aizawa had come back and heard Izuku when he offered his position of president to Ida in front of the class. Ida was, unsurprisingly, shocked by this and asked why. Izuku commemorated Ida's quick thinking back at the cafeteria, saying how he not only deduced the reason for the alarms, but also diffused the crowd of students before they turned into a full-blown stampede. Both Ida and Aizawa asked if he was serious about this, and Izuku nodded. It was then decided that Ida would take the spot as the class present representative, and Momo would be vice due to having the most votes. Gar couldn't help but feel a little disappointed that Izuku gave up his position, but had greater respect in the decision, no less. It took an honest person to admit they were not fit for a role, and an even humbler one to just hand it down willingly. Back in his younger years, Gar wasn't so sure he wanted to be champion due to the responsibility it held. Heck, Izuku reminded him of his younger self so much it almost scared him on occasion. He knew something like being class president would be a great step for Izuku to be more confident. But alas, it's not meant to be. Oh well, after all, Gar didn't become who he was in a day. And Izuku certainly won't either. He'll help him along the path. Baby step, just baby steps. The next day, Aizawa informed them that they were taking their training to an off-site facility to get them used to the sounds and feels of rescue missions. Everyone was extremely excited as they donned their costumes and filed onto the bus for the trip ahead, albeit after some senseless instruction from the ever-serious Ina. They sat on the bus and tried to kill time by talking, sleeping, or listening to music. Until Izuku noticed something was very off. Well, actually, two things were off. So as Tsuyu and Kaminari were roasting Bakugo like a BBQ chicken, he turned to Aizawa and asked, Sensei, where's All Might? I thought he was joining us. He had some last-minute work to do and will join us later. Aizawa replied without skipping a beat. Izuku looked around one last time and then asked, Where's Gar? That's when the whole class went completely silent. Now realizing that their interdimensional friend was nowhere on the bus, Aizawa sighed and answered. He said, and I quote, I'll take my own route there. What does he mean by that? Izuku asked as Aizawa shrugged. Look, Kaminari exclaimed while pointing to something out the window. Everyone crowded to one side of the bus as the driver shouted at them that they were going to set off the bus's alignment. Outside the window, in the river boarding, the cliff-bound road was none other than Gar riding along the stream on top of Gyarados' head like some kind of horse. Everyone marveled at this in amazement like a bunch of children, even though they've seen Gyarados plenty of times. Aizawa sighed in exasperation at this and continued his nap until they got there. Everyone still excitedly watched the older teen casually sit on the giant fish's head without a care in the world. And Gyarados cut through the water like it was running through the air, while fully keeping pace with the bus. Gar looked up from his resting position and waved to everyone on the bus, which they all waved back. Gar then did something that shocked them all and made them as giddy as a kid in a circus. He jumped off Gyarados' head while returning the creature into its pokeball. He then took out another pokeball at the same time, and Togekiss appeared right under him. Everyone cheered and hollered at this trick. Gar sat on Togekiss's back, and the bird egg flew over the surface of the water before flying up the cliff. Then up and over the bus. Everyone tried to follow his movements, but only saw the roof of the bus. They all shifted to the other side to see him, but only saw the opposite side of the rocky cliff. What they did not know or see was Gar appearing on Togekiss at the same side they were all staring out before. Gar tapped on the glass to get everyone's attention, and when he did, he waved at them with a bright smile. Everyone shifted back to stare in wonder and amazement, while commenting things like so cool or awesome, or I want to do that, or what a ham or show off or stuff like that. Gar then stood up on Togekiss's back, which worried some of them, then jumped into the air and watched as Togekiss performed several fast aerial spins and maneuvers like a performer. The Pokémon quickly adjusted itself in the air for Gar to perfectly land on its back and sit down. Everyone hooted and hollered with excitement as Gar did an improv bow like a stage performer. At the same time, the bus driver growls with agitation, and Aizawa mumbled about them being too noisy. Togekiss then flew away from the bus's side and flew along, following it to the giant glass dome in the distance. Just as everyone unloaded themselves from the bus, so too did Gar finally land with Togekiss. The bird egg shook itself and chirped happily as it rested on the ground. Gar slid off its back, and like a complete ham, he exclaimed, thank you, everyone. No, please, hold your applause. I really don't deserve such kindness. You are such a ham. Gyro playfully punched his arm. And you all love it. He shot back while sticking out his tongue. I thought you were told to not show your Pokémon out in public. Aizawa's tired voice stated rhetorically. Gar playfully punches Aizawa's arm while replying aloof, relaxes, eraser, no harm done. I'm very sneaky, so no one saw me traveling to this nowhere place. And besides, they need exercise. Being in the Pokeballs is fine, but having them out is where the relationship is built. He explained while petting Togekiss's head. Just try to abide by the rules, so things don't get crazier than they already are. Aizawa sighed. Once Aizawa was out of earshot, Izuku turned to Izuku and said, he really needs to lighten up. Izuku laughs nervously. That's part of his charm, I guess. Yeah, maybe, but my attack stat hasn't dropped. He joked while returning Togekiss. Wow, Gar-chan, your hero outfit is so cool, Kaminari exclaimed while looking over Gar's new hero outfit. Gar did several poses, even letting the hoodie fall past his shoulders to show off more, while saying, "Thanks, I love how it came out." Soon everyone was crowding around the older teen and admiring or commenting on his unusual, yet intriguing outfit that made him look like a Pokemon trainer and a hero mixed together. "It looks like your outfit when you first arrived," Izuku stated. Gar smiled and replied, "Well, if the shoe fits." Gar's new outfit really did look just like his previous trainer attire, only with several slight changes. Instead of a muscle shirt, he had a full-body skin-tight bodysuit that covered all but his arms to the shoulder. It was also purple with black markings and gold trimming with a huge pokeball symbol in the center. He wore purple and black workout shorts with gold trim over them with black shoes with purple rim. He had 2 purple fingerless gloves with black markings. He's also wearing the same purple and black headband he always wore that separated his top half purple hair and bottom half black hair. He wore a belt with all 6 of his pokeballs and the same several fanny pack looking bags with little faces all around his waist that carried, well, no one really knows yet. To top it off, he wore a hoodie that resembled the other one with big red eyes markings, a toothy smile in the back, and little nubs on the top that looked like ears. The hoodie was open, and the hood was off his head. "What's up with the fanny packs? Why the evil faces?" Kirishima asked. "Oh, these aren't evil faces. They're ghost-type Pokemon," he explained while pointing at the packs. "See, this one is Dusknoir, this is Sableye, and this is Galgeist, this is Bennett, and this is Configrigus, Palossand, Chandelure, and—" Okay, dude, we get it. You like ghost types." Zero cut him off. "Not really, I like all Pokemon," he explained. "I always change up my style depending on how I'm feeling or what type I feel like using. So today, I'm feeling spooky. Woo-woo," he did a mock ghost scare. "So what? Have you got the other 17 types of clothing getting made?" Mina teased him. "Yeah," he replied seriously. Then Aizawa's voice cut through the crowd as he stated firmly, "You can admire each other's costumes and ask questions later. We're burning daylight here." Everyone then scrambled behind Aizawa and headed off into the giant glass dome. Once inside, everyone was taken in awe of just how massive the whole place was. Not only did it look near to a mile long and wide, but it was dug into the ground with a glass dome covering it. Along its trails were just about every kind of disaster you could imagine, all artificial and placed in super controlled environments. Even Rotom was so impressed that he popped out and began to take pictures of everything. There was a massive staircase that stretched down to the bottom, but stopped halfway with a lookout platform. Everyone was in amazement until Gar piped up and made them all nearly double over from laughter. "Wow, this place is so big it might just fit Katsuki and All Might's combined egos." Everyone immediately burst into laughter. Some were nearly falling over just from how hard they were laughing. Even Aizawa had to cough and sputter to keep from laughing. All were laughing except for Bakugo, who was glaring at Gar and cursing him up a storm, but failing to come over the noise of everyone's screams of exuberance. After everyone caught their breath and calmed down, Ida approached Gar to scold him, albeit trying his best to stifle his chuckles. "Gar-kun chuckle. You shouldn't chuckle. I mean, you really chuckle. It's not very heroic to chuckle." Ida couldn't even finish his thought from how hard he was trying to compose himself, nearly falling to his knees. "Oh come on, dude, he is right." Kaminari laughs hard. "Even Yua isn't big enough just for Bakugo's," Gyro sassed, while trying to keep her composure. This made everyone belly laugh again, this time with Gar joining in the laughter and nearly doubling over himself. When they calmed down again, a new person came onto the scene, also laughing with them. When they saw the new person, many stopped and awed before the new hero standing in front of them and laughing with them. The hero was dressed exactly like an astronaut, but with emoting white eyes under her helm and big yellow shoes. The hero gave a few more chuckles and then asked, "What are we laughing at?" "Oh my god, it's the space hero, 13. Uraraka screeched like a fangirl, while waving her arms excitedly at 90-degree angles. No way, one person exclaimed. So cool, another added. I heard she was working here. Izuku fanboyed while blushing excitedly. Who? Gar asked, unimpressed. Uraraka whipped her head over to Gar and demanded in surprise. You've never heard of 13? Gar gave her a naturally displeased face, which she understood immediately, and calming down, she followed up awkwardly. Oh right, of course, you haven't. So her hero name is just a number? Gar asked, confused by the bland simplicity. Haven't you heard of the space mission Apollo 13? Ida asked. Ooh. Gar made an expression like he realized the reference, only to immediately backtrack and say, huh. I'll tell you later, Uraraka told him. Gar sighed and shrugged, and he said, I may not know her, but I do know a thing or two about space. Izuku looked at Gar inquisitively as the older teen came down to his level and whispered, I have a Pokemon that's an alien. It's called Deoxys. Izuku's eyes immediately filled with curiosity and excited sparkles at this. After 13 calmed down enough to speak, she welcomed them, saying, Yes, everyone, it is I, 13, and welcome to the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, or USJ for short. 13 then explained everything about the USJ, everything inside of it, and what they'll be doing as far as rescue training with her, and using their quirks in a safe way to do so. As she continued, Gar didn't notice that one of his Pokeballs was shaking. Suddenly it popped open, and Mimikyu appeared behind the group and walked away. Gar caught the sound of a Pokeball opening and looked around to see which of his Pokemon escaped. After a quick glance, he saw Mimikyu walking away from the group near the edge of the stairs. Mimikyu, Gar questioned, breaking away from the group and walking towards the small Pokemon. Luckily, Mimikyu did not move down the stairs and instead stood right at the foot of them and looked over the edge towards the sprawling landscape of disasters. Gar came down to one knee and leaning down to pick the Pokemon up, he cooed, Hey, there you are. What are you doing out of your ball, silly Pokemon? You like the view? Hiss. Mimikyu suddenly hiss aloud, causing Gar to jump back in surprise. Whoa, Mimikyu, you okay? What's gotten you all riled up? Gar tried to calm down the tense Pokemon. Just then, Gar saw what Mimikyu was hissing at, and spotted a small black dot begin to appear while growing bigger. Gar immediately felt a sense of dread run up his spine as he scooped Mimikyu into his arms and slowly backed away. Without looking at the group of students, he exclaimed to them, guys, I think we should leave. Like, right now. 13 stopped her long-winded speech. Aizawa turned to him exasperated, and the rest of the class looked at him in confusion. What? But we just got here. Why do you want to leave? One person moaned. Hiss. Mimikyu hissed even louder, gaining everyone's attention. I really think we should leave, Gar said in a dread-filled tone, while pointing to the larger grow dot that now had two long, thin yellow eyes. A pale, shriveled-up hand emerged from the portal connected to the most terrifying person imaginable. If he were a slasher movie villain, then he'd be a tear. He was tall and lanky, very lanky. He has messy matted bluish-gray hair, a black shirt, black pants, and a black overcoat with red shoes. The worst part of all was the several disembodied hands that covered his arms, shoulders, and head, with one covering his face like a mask. Behind him stepped out several dozen other people who could best be described as villains that just came pouring out like water from a faucet. What the? Aizawa exclaimed in genuine surprise. Whoa, cool. Mock villain invasion. This place has it all, Kaminari exclaimed excitedly. This is not a part of the training simulation, 13 warned them. Kaminari immediately sunk into himself in those words and meekly said, Oh, this is a real invasion. 13. Get the other students out of here. Kaminari, send a distress call. I'll handle the villains. Aizawa instructed the hero while putting on his yellow goggles and unraveling his capture weapon. I can't. Something's blocking the communications, Kaminari exclaimed in panic while tapping his headgear. Gar then thought fast and looked at the floating phone cowering behind Ida. He said, "Rotom, see if you can bypass it." "Buzzed? I can't," he replied in fear. Gar looked at him in incredulous shock as he shot back. "What do you mean, you can't? Can you counter-hack it or something?" Rotom got so panicked, he began to make panicked siren noises while half shouting. "This isn't someone hacking the systems. This is a jamming frequency." Buzzed. "It's like there's an electric barrier that keeps any signal from moving in or out." Buzzed. Gar ground his teeth and cursed, saying, "Arceus, damn it. Can you get into the system and bypass it yourself through all the fizz?" Rotom stopped panicking for a moment as he thought to himself. A moment of deep thought, and he replied, "I don't know, but I'll give it a shot." Bust. Gar nodded with a serious and assured expression to the Pokémon and held out his hand. The phone flew over to the open palm, and the phone dropped right into it as Rotom popped out of it in his light bulb form. "Good luck, buddy," Gar assured him. Rotom gave a mock salute while letting out a few electrical noises and was off like a bolt of lightning, sporadically buzzing all over the place before disappearing into a light fixture. Gar nodded at this and placed Mimikyu on his shoulder. He turned back to the oncoming flood of villains. "And as for you," he said while taking out 2 Pokeballs from his belt and throwing them into the air. "Gyarados, Volcarona, prepare for battle." The Pokeballs opened and out popped the red Gyarados, sparkling and glittering in its shiny coat as it emerged, along with a completely new Pokémon that looked like a giant human-sized bug that radiated extreme heat. The bug was human-sized, which was really off-putting, Cass, but it looked something like a moth. Its head was black with large light blue eyes and 2 red horn-like antennae at the sides of its face that came from below to above the top. Its upper body was covered in fluffy white hair with 4 stubby legs poking out. Its thorax is divided into 3 parts with individual segments. The 2 on the side were light blue with black dots, and the middle was pure black. It flew in the air with 6 wings that looked like tiger lily petals, and its wings gave off an immense heat that started to make everyone sweat with every flap. "What the hell are those things?" one villain shouted. "Are those monsters?" another one questions. "Yua has war beasts?" another exclaimed. "I didn't sign up for this," another moaned in fear. Aizawa flung out his arm to stop the teen and firmly commanded him. "No, Gar, fall back with the others and get out of here. Use your Pokémon to protect yourselves." Gar gave him an incredulous look and sassed back. "And you'll what? Take these villains all on your own? Fat chance. You're better with 1v1, and I can handle crowd control. Let's work together." Izuku popped in and agreed with Gar, saying, "Gar is right, Aizawa-sensei. Your quirk isn't meant for combat. And if one of those stronger guys catches you or someone with a mutation, it's over. But with the 2 of you working together, you'll have a better chance of winning." Gar nodded with him. Aizawa gave a displeased huff and replied, "I appreciate the thought, but I'm not someone trick pony. I'm a pro hero for a reason." This gave Izuku a dreaded feeling in the pit of his stomach, while Gar clicked his tongue in aggravation. Even if he refused, he would still go with it. "But you're right. We'll have a better chance if we work together." Aizawa followed up. Gar smiled at his responses, and shooting an arm out, he commanded his Pokémon. "Then I'll take the lead. Volcarona, stun them with Bug Buzz. Gyarados, use Dragon Pulse and hit as many as you can." Volcarona then began to vibrate its wings at such a fast pace that they emitted a high-frequency sound that could literally be seen by the naked eye. The noise was ear-splitting and so painful that several villains already climbing the stairs were forced to their knees from the pain ringing in their skulls. Once the villains were stunted, Gyarados opened its mouth and shot out a beam of multicolored energy that took the form of a dragon head. The beam hit several villains and sent them flying all around. Gyarados then shifted the beam all around to hit as many targets as possible. Villains and debris flew all over the place, and no one could reach the young heroes. "Go, Eraser!" I've got crowd control covered. You pick off the remainder and try to find the leader. Gar shouted at the tried hero. Aizawa jumped from the straight at the straggling villains that survived the attack and activated his quirk. As the stragglers saw the black-clad man flying towards them, some tried to attack with their quirks, but quickly found that they had no control over them. Before they could even question what was going on, Aizawa wrapped them in his capture weapon and began to knock them out one by one. This continued in a pattern. Volcarona would stun a large group of villains, Gyarados would blast as many as he could, and Aizawa would pick off the remainders while looking for the leader. They only had to do this 3 times before things were manageable enough for Aizawa to take over completely. Izuku's eyes sparkled at seeing his teacher in action, and in a dreamy tone fanboyed. Sensei is so cool. Admire later. Escape first. Gar snapped at him as Gyarados let loose another dragon pulse. Izuku fumbled with himself, and then ran back to the class that was already making their escape. But just as they were mere feet from the door, the black mist with eyes appeared and took the form of a man, made of the mist in a full waiter suit with a huge metal neck brace, blocking the way. Hello, Yua. He greeted them with a deep, yet politely menacing voice. 13 then shoved several students behind her and activated her quirk. She shouted, "Get behind me, children." 13's quirk then began to rapidly suck up the mist man in huge quantities, almost completely sucking him in, until his mist body appeared behind her, and that's when he realized his quirk was some kind of gate mist. As 13's quirk was used against her, the entirety of her backside was completely sucked up and shredded to pieces. The hero let out a panicked cry and deactivated her quirk just before passing out. 13, Yuraoka cried in terror. "No!" Izuku shouted. The mist man reformed and waved a smoky finger. He said, "Tisk, tisk, tisk. Such a shame. Putting your student before yourself without thinking," he said while looking down at the unconscious hero. Then looked back at the teen, ready to defend. "Though I'm afraid to inform you that I cannot let you go under my master's orders." He then bowed politely and said, "I come as a messenger from the League of Villains. We've come to kill All Might. But I see he isn't here." "So you were the reason those reporters broke into Yua," a student exclaimed. The mist man looked up and confirmed his notion. "Indeed. But enough talk. I think you all will come in handy for our plan. Once our followers have disposed of you, we'll use it against you as image and All Might to more easily assassinate him," he stated while narrowing his yellow eyes. "Like the distortion world, you are, Shadow Claw," Gar shouted as Mimikyu, who snuck up behind the mist man, popped out with its beady eye glittering and quickly swiping out its thin 3-clawed arm at the mist man's body. But the attack phased right through him, like a normal type move hitting a ghost type. Even Mimikyu was surprised by this. Gar momentarily froze and stuttered out in shock. "Wah, it went right through him. Attacks like that won't harm me," he explained. Gar ground his teeth and stated, "Then let's try something new." Just before he could give Mimikyu an order, even while Mimikyu took on its psycho face, the mist man agreed, saying, "I couldn't agree more." Before anyone could do anything, black mist collected around all the teens' feet in a giant ring that was so big it even reached Gar and his 2 Pokémon still defending the rear. The teens quickly felt gravity work against them and fell straight through the ground. Even Gar's Pokémon fell through the ground. Everyone tried to jump or move out of the range, but to no avail, and only failed like fish trying to escape. Even Gyarados wriggled and roared with all its might to escape the sinking motion. Only Volcarona was able to escape, and the giant bug flew over to where Gar was sinking and dove down after him. A moment later, Volcarona emerged from the mist with Gar on its back. "Thanks, Volcarona." Gar thanked the Pokémon with a cough. Gar looked around and saw the last few remaining people disappear into the mist, and caught a glimpse of Gyarados' head sinking into the blackness before he could even pull a Pokeball out. Gar gasped and shouted in panic, "Everyone, Gyarados, no!" Once everyone had vanished from his eyes, Gar let out an angry sound and threw out 2 Pokeballs in a fury. Togekiss, Dragapult, go! He shouted as both Pokemon materialized from their capsules. We're under attack, and everyone has been separated. Find and protect anyone you come across. He commanded his 2 Pokemon in a firmly panicked tone. Togekiss immediately sensed Gar's distress and tried to fly over to comfort him. But the older teen stuck out his hand for the creature to stop, making Togekiss flinch at the gesture. Don't worry about me. I got this. Go, now, he shouted in a tone that left no room for discussion. Dragapult nodded its head, straightened out its body, and then flew off at Mach speed in one direction. Togekiss froze in place from Gar's tone and reaction, but listened after a moment and flew off in the opposite direction. Gar couldn't help but feel bad for raising his voice at Togekiss. But this was a crisis. Gar. The older teen heard his name called out. Whipping his head to the voice, he saw Izawa hanging from a tree, like an ape. The pro-hero pointed a finger out towards the center part of the field and exclaimed, "That guy with the hands must be the leader." Gar looks out and sees the first guy that came through the mist portal, still standing in the same place the whole time and appearing to be yelling at some of the villains trying to escape, alongside the mist man who shattered his friends to who knows where. He then saw Izawa make a bunch of hand gestures and immediately understood what to do next. He gestured back and turned his attention to the 2 villains. Gar growled under his breath and commanded his Pokemon, Volcarona, land. The bug obeyed and landed on the stony ground where the large swarm of villains once were, only a few hundred yards from the hand leader and the mist man lackey. Gar hopped off the bug and took out one last Pokeball that he rolled around in his palm. He sighed anxiously and said to himself, "One last Pokemon. Hope the 2 of you are enough." He then threw the ball into the air and shouted, "Go Superior." The Pokeball flew through the air and popped open to manifest a brand new creature before the villain's eyes. In simple terms, it looked like a giant grass snake in fancy leaf wear. In more complexity, it was a pale green snake-like creature far larger than a man. It even outsized Gar. It had a regal and noble yet snobbish complexity to its gaze with deep, striking red eyes. Its pale green color had a helmet-like design to it with a white face. The back and upper portion of its long body are dark green. In the lower jaw, 2 fangs are visible when its mouth is open. There are 2 pointed yellow extensions on the back of its head. Coiled, dark green extensions spread out from the sides of its lower neck, forming a curving pattern lower down the body. Just below its neck, it has 2 small leaf-like hands coming out of either side. It has curved yellow markings around its middle and several palmate leaves on its tail with ivy-shaped leaves at the tip. When the snake landed on the ground with a powerful thud, it pointed its nose up in a high society manner, puffed out its chest, and let out a strange noise like that of a reptile mixed with a bird. The hand leader scratched at his neck and tilted his head to the side. He asked inquisitively, "Kurogiri, who's the purple guy?" The mist man, Kurogiri, tapped his neck piece while looking through some paper with a hum in his voice. "I'm not sure. He must be new. There's no record of him from the data you collected," he answered with equal unsureness and unease. The hand man scratched his neck again and humid in his throat, while saying in amazement, "So, a secret side character. And he's a summoner with multiple familiars. Interesting. The only question now is, how do we get rid of him? Kill the familiars until the summoner is vulnerable. Or kill the summoner, so the familiars are vulnerable. I guess we'll test our new Namu and find out." He looked to Kurogiri and the mist man bowed while opening up a new portal. A moment later, and a huge black hand emerged that was nearly the size of the hand guy. It pulled itself out of the portal and showed itself to be a truly disgusting thing to look at. It was like a human, with a human body complete with fingers and pants and everything. But it was bigger than a mudstale, more swollen than a match hand, had a huge yellow bird beak with visible teeth, and unblinking dead fish eyes coming out of an exposed brain. Gar nearly vomited at the thing he was seeing and tried his best to keep his composure. He breathed a calming breath and, addressing the villains, he stated, "So I see you have your own Pokemon. Never seen one like that before. Is it some kind of failed clone?" He tried to vex them. The hand man scratched his neck on the other side and replied in a horse's tone, "Is that what you call them? Pokemon? It has a nice ring. But no, my Namu isn't a clone. But it is an experiment. Allow me to demonstrate." At this, the Namu then got into a fighting position and ready to attack. Gar steadied himself again and pulled his Pokemon in close. He spoke in a low tone. "All right, listen close you two. We've only got one shot at this, so you gotta be on your game, got it?" The two Pokemon gave off silent cries of understanding. Gar smiled and said, "Good to hear. Now we gotta get their leader for this invasion to end early. So Volcarona, you'll distract that thing, while Superior sneaks up and restrains him." Both Pokemon nodded in response. They took the opposite side in front of Gar, like a defensive position, while getting into their attack-ready stance. Gar gave a bold smile as he thrust out his arm, yelling, "Then let's begin. Volcarona, use Heat Wave, and Superior, use Dig." Gar shouted in command. Superior then jumped into the air and burrowed underground, disappearing from sight. Volcarona's wings began to glow brightly and flap them hard. From its wings, it blew forth a gale of searing hot air. The heat and air pressure were so intense that it not only pushed back the giant muscle, but also scorched its already black skin. The heat was so intense that it actually began to burn and peel away chunks of its skin, leaving it raw and pink. The heat wave dissipated and left the giant creature steaming like a freshly burnt biscuit. A moment later, and the creature's wounds began to heal all on their own. "It used Recover?" Gar questioned in anxiety. Once it healed, the Namu charged at Volcarona with blinding speed. So fast that Gar barely had enough time to react. "Dodge!" he shouted, and Volcarona moved out of the way just in time. "Quiver Dance," he commanded, and Volcarona began to do a little dance that sent a red aura around its body. Good. Now that Volcarona's special attack, special defense, and speed stats are up, it'll give him the edge to keep that thing distracted long enough for Superior to attack, Gar said to himself. Nomu made a fast dash to swipe at the Pokemon, and Gar shouted in a moment, "Bug Buzz." Volcarona moved out of reach and vibrated its wings, making the same sound it did before. Like with the villains, the Namu fell to its knees due to the sound and began to roar with pain. The hand guy was visibly shocked by this. He knew that his Namu was strong and fast. Sure, the Pokemon was keeping out of reach, but for how long? And its strength definitely outweighs the bug. But he never expected noise to hurt it or anything. It could heal and was practically an organic rubber. He scratched his neck in aggravation and shouted at Namu to just squash the bug. Once the noise stopped, the Namu recovered quickly and was already trying to grab Volcarona. But thanks to the stat boost, it was able to evade. Then ensued into a game of cat and mouse, with once barely able to dodge or catch the other. The fight captured the hand villain's full attention, as he didn't notice the moving soil coming towards him. "Heat Wave," Gar shouted at Volcarona, and the Pokemon let loose another stream of searing hot air, this time at point blank. Namu's skin immediately began to flake and burn off. Some parts even ignited on fire. When the heat subsided, the Namu was still and smelling like a piece of burnt rubber. Then it surprised both Pokemon and trainer when it suddenly lunged forward and snagged the giant bug Pokemon. Volcarona struggled to break free, but to no avail, as Namu's strength was far superior. Even Gar was thrown off guard and fell to his butt in surprise. The hand man smiled maliciously with a sadistic gleam in his red eyes as he watched and waited in anticipation for Namu to crush the bug. But this distraction was all it took for him to get caught. A moment later, and a large dark green tail emerged from the ground. surprising both villains enough for them to freeze up. Constrict, Gar yelled as the tail wrapped around the hand guy in a mere second, while Superior's head emerged from the ground, shaking off dirt. Superior looked down at the villain with the most displeased and unimpressed expression alive as it tightened its grip and squeezed him with its body. The villain squeaked and panted as the snake Pokemon slowly squeezed him tighter and tighter, feeling his already thin and bony body begin to cave in, and felt the sensation of his brittle bones breaking while his breath shortened. He couldn't even catch his breath long enough to concentrate as his vision started to fade in and out. All while Kirigiri stood by in frustration, unsure of what to do. The hand villain then noticed that one of his hands was free and tried to attack the snake. The villain's glare and speed were so quick that it made Superior lose focus for a moment, until Gar's voice snapped the Pokemon onto attack mode again. Poison Fang. Then, the Pokemon tightened its grip, opened its mouth, and bit down hard on the villain's forearm, keeping him from touching the snake. The villain screamed in pain from the bite and tried to wreck his arm free. But Superior just held tight. The villain was able to scream because Superior had to use some of her muscles for a different purpose and allowed a little bit of breathing room, though not too much, as Superior quickly began to switch gears and used both muscle groups at the same time. The hand villain looked to his underling for help, and the Mist Man finally came to his senses, taking out a gun and pointing it to Superior's head. Superior glared at the man with annoyance in her eyes. Meanwhile, Gar was looking to get Volcarona free from the monster's grip, as it was slowly being crushed. "Bug Biz," he shouted, and the giant bug vibrated its wings again. The sound made the Nummo release Volcarona, and the Pokemon flew around the monster, while continuing to make the awful sound. "Since we can't knock its health down completely, we'll just have to weed it out. Use Giga Drain," he commanded. Volcarona then stopped buzzing and began to absorb green energy from Namu's body, which slowly reduced it to a more natural body shape. The Pokemon continued to fly around the monster while absorbing the green energy and making it look much weaker, to the point its bones began to show through its dark skin. The absorption eventually stopped, and the creature was on its knees while breathing heavily. Seeing he had a chance, Gar looked towards the villains, with the Mist villain pointing his gun at Superior's head, while the Pokemon held the leader in her coils while biting down on his one free arm. He then addressed the villain, calling them out and saying, "Hey, Mist Guy, I wouldn't do that if I were you." Kirigiri didn't put his gun down but still glanced at the older team. Superior cells are like a bamboo stalk, so they're at their strongest when constricted. Right now, her body has the same strength as steel. Even if you shot her in the head, it'll just bounce off and make her squeeze your leader tighter. Kirigiri looked back at the Pokemon, glaring daggers at him, and the hand villain was still screaming in pain while struggling to get free. His hand got shaky as he considered their dilemma, dropped his weapon, and turned to Gar. He asked, "What do you want?" "Isn't it obvious?" he stated. "Surrender and call off your Pokemon. I'm afraid only young Master Tamura is the only one that can control Namu," Kirigiri explained. Gar looked at the hand villain, Tamura, who stopped screaming due to being squeezed hard enough not to breathe, and commanded his Pokemon, "Superior, let him have some breathing room." Superior obeyed and loosened her coils around her prey, allowing Tamura to breathe properly. The villain took in gulps of air as he finally felt his lungs again and dropped his head from exhaustion. He then looked up at Gar with pure hatred in his red eyes as Gar acknowledged him. "Okay, listen up here, hand guy or Tamura or whatever your name is. You're gonna call off your pet before it heals and give up, or Superior is gonna have the choice to squeeze you again or bite you with Poison Fang in a different place," he demanded. Tamura looked around at his situation. He was at the mercy of this snake thing. His Namu was still slowly regenerating. Kirigiri was useless at this point, and that guy still had one familiar to use. He could try to bide time so the Namu could get back to killing them. But then there's the snake, and the fact he lost all feeling in his left arm from whatever poison was injected into him. That's not also counting the pro hero that was nowhere to be seen, so he was on a time frame. But what was he to do? He was angry. So angry. He wanted to break free, rot the snake, and kill the purple teen with his bare hands. But he was stuck. Suddenly the Namu, still laying on the floor, slowly regenerating its body, pulled as fast as one and dashed towards Volcarona and slapped it to the side. The bug flew across the area and rolled across the floor, though he quickly got back up due to Namu's failing strength. The Namu then roared, and its body inflated back to its super muscular frame. Gar panicked and fell to his butt, trying to get away from the monster. At the same time, Eraserhead, who was sneaking around the fight, emerged from the shadows and jumped into the air, trying to subdue Kurogiri with his capture weapon. But Kurogiri was quick and used the gun he still had in his hand to shoot Eraser. Luckily, he missed his body and only got his shoulder. Eraser winched and lost concentration on the Mist Man as he disappeared from his capture weapon. With the distraction he needed, Tamura looked at Namu and yelled, "Finish off the bug quick, and then help me." Tamura then felt his body, breath, and voice crushed again as Superior tightened her coils. Eraserhead landed on the ground holding his shoulder, but worked through the pain as he focused on the Mist Man with the gun. Namu dashed towards the Pokemon, still getting back up, and before Gar could give a command, the creature punched Volcarona towards the teen with extreme force. Volcarona sputtered out in pain as his body was thrown by the sheer force and grazed right past Gar. Gar watched as his Pokemon flew past him, and then slammed right into a tree with such force that the plant broke. "Volcarona," Gar shouted. The Namu then turned on its heels and ran straight for Superior. But Gar had enough reaction to give a command this time. "Throw him and get away with Dig," he shouted as Superior threw Tamura at Namu and burrowed underground. Tamura slapped against his monster like a wet fish as Namu paid no mind and continued towards Superior's previous spot and punched the ground. Gar sighed with relief seeing his Pokemon escape until Tamura got up from the ground, clutching his limp arm, and gave a different command. "Forget the snake and kill the purple summoner," he yelled as he pointed at Gar. Gar gasped as the Namu turned on its heels again and dashed towards him with blinding speed. Gar tried to run away, but his legs failed him as he tripped and fell on his face. He turned around just as Namu was upon him and covered his face for the life-ending punch. Suddenly Gar felt something wrap around his body and pull him away from the Namu just before it crushed him. Gar's arms were ripped from his face by the pulling force, and he saw Aizawa some ways away using his capture weapon to save him. Just then, Tamura snuck up behind Aizawa, and as he was distracted saving Gar, he grabbed his elbow with his hand, and the man's arm began to decay. The rotting happened so fast that the muscle underneath his skin began to show. Aizawa winched from the pain, but still pulled through to move Gar to safety. "Eraser," Gar shouted in fear, "just like you heroes do. You put others before yourself and don't finish the job leading to your own demise and others. You could have taken us down and only had one casualty." Tamura vexed him as he gripped his elbow harder. Aizawa said nothing and tried to attack the handman, but he moved out of the way before the blow could land. Aizawa's breath was now ragged, and his right arm was just barely holding up as it bled heavily. "I would have killed you right there, but I'd like to see you suffer first and use my quirk on someone more deserving of it. So I'll let my Namu take care and finish you off first, while I rot your summoner myself. I'll be sure you have a front row seat to watch." He smiled coldly at him. Before Aizawa could retaliate, Namu was already upon him and slapping him around like a piece of raw meat. Gar froze at this sight from the fear that ran up his skin, but he pushed it away and shouted, "Superior, save Eraserhead." The moment those words left his lips, Superior appeared from the ground the Namu was standing on and began to wrap around it. She wrapped once around the Namu's arm and one around its neck. Superior squeezed with all her might and began to choke the Namu out while pulling its hand away from Aizawa who was pinned under it. The Namu roared as it choked from Superior's strength. But the Namu was still stronger as it grabbed one of the Pokemon's coils and tried to peel it off. Gar saw this and commanded the Pokemon, Poison Fang. Superior opened its mouth with purple fangs and bit down right on Namu's exposed brain. The monster roared in pain and let go of the Pokemon coiled, allowing her to squeeze harder. The Namu tousled around trying to whip the Pokemon off, but Superior just held on tight. That allowed Aizawa to come back to his senses, and the man tried to pull himself back to his feet, trying to work through the pain all over his body. Tamura didn't like how his luck shifted away from him yet again and commanded Namu, "Stop screaming and peel that snake off you." The Namu obeyed, and with its free arm, it grabbed the Pokemon and pulled it off in one swift motion. However, this also made it pull off a bit of its brain from where Superior was biting down. The Namu pressed on as it slammed Superior on the ground multiple times before throwing the Pokemon against a nearby boulder. Superior crumbled down and laid on the ground in an unresponsive state. Gar gasped at seeing his Pokemon be puny gone by the monster, and had to hold himself back from running towards her. However, Superior opened her eyes and tried to bring her head up. Gar sighed with joy at seeing his Pokemon still well, but it immediately dropped when he saw Namu rush towards her again. "Leaf Storm," he shouted. Superior forced herself up and let out a cry. Many leaves came from her body, along with leaves from every nearby plant, and rose into the air. Superior then roared in Namu's direction, and all the leaves swirling around like a storm right at the monster. The leaves sliced up the Namu and halted its charge towards the Pokemon for a brief time. The storm quickly picked up double speed and then began to make huge gashes and caused chunks of the monster to fall off. Once the storm subsided, the Namu took off again, causing Superior and Gar to freeze up in fear, giving the monster enough time to close the distance and punch Superior straight in the face. Superior flew upwards from the punch's force and passed out once she hit the floor with swirls in her eyes. Namu was about to finish the job and smash Superior's head, but completely missed when Gar took out his Pokeball and safely returned the creature. "Superior, return," he shouted as Superior's body turned into energy, which was what the Namu punched. Gar then pocketed the Pokeball and ran towards Volcarona, who was still slumped against the tree. As he checked his Pokemon, Namu went into position to attack Gar, but Tamura held up his arm and stopped Namu's intended attack. No, Namu, he's mine. You can go back to playing with Eraserhead," he told the monster as it retackled Aizawa and held his face to the ground while smashing it into the ground repeatedly. As Gar was distracted, Tamura ran towards him with rapid speed. Gar heard the footsteps as Volcarona was coming to and saw the villain charging towards him. Gar froze for a moment out of fear, but forced himself out of it and stood between Volcarona and the villain with his arms spread to block his hurt Pokemon. Tamura smiled wickedly at this, seeing as it made him more vulnerable while causing excitement to shoot through his body, causing him to run faster. Gar was scared out of his wits and not thinking straight, but stood from waiting to take the blow. Volcarona saw what his trainer was doing and looked on in amazement and horror at what would happen. He vaguely knew something terrible would happen after hearing the fight between Superior and that thing moments ago, especially for the amount of fearful yelling Gar was doing. Volcarona was filled with a new sense of energy and determination in his body. He wanted to get up. He wanted to fight. He wanted to protect Gar from any harm, and he is going to do so. Volcarona spread its sore wings and lifted up into the air, then flew right in front of Gar, protecting him from the incoming villain. Gar was shocked by this and exclaimed, "No, Volcarona, don't do this. You're still hurt. Let me protect you." But the protest fell on deaf ears as the bug Pokemon stood firm with a furiously determined expression on its insect face. Tamura smiled wider at this and shouted maliciously, "How touching. I'll dewing your bug and then rot your head off in front of it." Tamura closed the distance with the last word and immediately grabbed one of Volcarona's 6 wings, which was the wrong part to grab. The moment that his fingers grazed over the scaly wing, Tamura's entire body went up in flames. He screamed in agonizing pain while jumping away from the bug and rolled on the ground, trying to put himself out. The screams were so loud it actually drew Namu's attention, thinking he was being given a command. Kirigiri noticed this immediately and sprung into action. Using his warp quirk, he opened a portal over Tamura that gushed water onto him from another part of the facility. Once thoroughly soaked, Tamura stopped rolling around and screaming and laid there on the ground, breathing heavily while trying to satiate the pain of the flames. He looked up at Gar, who had a shocked expression for a moment before it turned to one of pride, which ticked Tamura off. I probably forgot to warn you about touching Volcarona's wings. They are said to be as hot as the surface of the sun. But don't worry, Volcarona would never purposefully burn someone he didn't trust, he stated with a smug tone while the bug chattered his mandibles. Tamura ground his teeth and tried to pick himself back up, but the screaming pain of his body refused. Kirigiri appeared next to Tamura and began to treat him. Once the 2 villains were distracted, Gar looked over to Aizawa and saw that Namu had gone back to slamming his face into the ground. Gar immediately felt the urge to help, but he didn't know how to. 4 of his Pokemon were gone. 1 was unable to battle, and the other was just barely hanging on. So what could he do to help? He couldn't just fight that thing. He'd die. Just then, Volcarona, who sensed his distress, nuzzled him to calm him down. Gar hugged the giant incense fluffy white upper body and whispered in despair, "Oh Volcarona, what'll I do? I can't help Aizawa. But I have to, or else he'll die. And he's only in that situation because of me." The Pokemon then pulled away from Gar and began to fly towards Namu. Gar immediately knew what he was doing and spread in front of him, saying, "No, Volcarona, you're too hurt. Those things are too strong. And you barely survived the last hit it gave you into that tree." Volcarona tried to move past him, but Gar refused to let him go, exclaiming, "No, I'm not letting you fight any further. You're going back into your Pokeball to rest, and that's final." Gar then took out the bug's Pokeball and was about to return him when said Pokemon grabbed the device and flew up high enough that it was out of his reach. "Hey, give that back," he shouted at the Pokemon. But Volcarona wouldn't listen. Gar stopped trying to jump up and snag the ball from him, realizing that the Pokemon was serious. Seeing him stop his painfully pathetic attempts, Volcarona flew back down to Gar's eyes level. They both looked each other in the eyes for a long while. Volcarona, seeing Gar's worry and fear, and Gar seeing Volcarona's fiery determination. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Gar asked the Pokemon. Volcarona nodded while letting out a few bug noises. Seeing there was no way of convincing the bug Pokemon, Gar conceded to his desire. Volcarona gave Gar back its Pokeball, and the older teenager put the ball back on his belt. He then went into one of his pouch pockets and pulled out a light green spray bottle device labeled Full Restore. He gripped the bottle tightly in his hand and said in a low tone, "Last one. Better make it count." Gar unloaded the context of the bottle on his Pokemon's body, and Volcarona looked visibly healthier and stronger. Volcarona then flew out, ready to fight. But Gar stopped him one last time, saying, "No. If you're going to fight that thing, you're not going to do it alone." Volcarona immediately knew what he meant and positioned itself to where its back was at a 180-degree angle. Gar smiled and climbed on the giant's back, gripping to his fluffy white body like reins. The Pokemon flapped its wings hard and flew like a rocket towards the monster still pounding Aizawa. They passed by the 2 villains as Tamura was starting to heal up from Kirigiri's treatment, leaving a trail of hot air in their wake. They were just about to the Namu when Gar shouted for its attention, "Hey, monster!" The Namu stopped its assault and looked up at the older teen riding Volcarona. Once they were close enough, Volcarona then flew up and spread its 6 wings as they glowed with dangerous brightness, while letting out an angry cry. "Let go of Aizawa, right now," he demanded of the monster.